Chapter 1. It was spring in the Montana Rockies. Already the ice and snow had gone out of the valleys and canyons. Luxuriant grasses covered the lowlands in riotous emerald carpets, and the cottonwoods and willows along the rushing streams had taken on their spring foliage. But it was a bitterly cold Friday night up there in the high notch of Blacksmith Pass, and the wheezy old engine at the head of the hoof, human, oil and spit Devil Express labored gallantly to pull its short string of mixed cars on the wild 80-mile upcountry run over the mountains from Gun Creek Junction to Badland. Ungodly odors wafted back to the two squeaking little day coaches on the tail end of the train. The passengers in the smoker, which was the rear compartment of the combined baggage and express car, were mostly an unsavory lot. The air was thick with the smell of them, the half-suffocating odor of liquor, and clouds of tobacco smoke. There were about 20 men, and they were a colorful collection of big hats and mackinaws, bright shirts, and chaps. In the little mob were hard-drinking oil men, sheepmen, cattlemen, and cowpunchers, an enormously broad and tall Indian wrapped in a red blanket who called himself Chief Hair of the Dog, and 8 burly shotgun guards armed like bandits whose job it was to protect a $90,000 payroll shipment of silver and currency bound for the new oil boom town on Poison River. "It reminds me a heap of Noah's Ark," declared a short, thick-set man jammed against a window in the western side of the smoker, a man with a wart the size of a robin's egg on his chin. Cows bawling ahead, horses grunting, varmints howling down the canyon, and us riding peaceful with all the brutes, two-legged and otherwise. "I'll bet that fat fellow with the red handkerchief round his neck has stole horses somewhere. He's the plumb ugliest-eyed son of a gun I ever dropped my eyeballs on, barring none. He looks like something the Gophers have drug out its hole by mistake." His companion, a tall, clean-cut man, jabbed him with an elbow. Bull Sheldon had had too much to drink. Sheldon looked like a cowboy tramp from the old red hat jammed on the back of his head to the rusty-looking boots, the bent spurs at his heels, the old red mackinaw, and the whiskey-splattered green shirt. He was as ruddy as a lowering sun, and his scarred face was made more homely by a fuzzy beard, the ends of which looked as if they had been dipped in a barrel of red ink. The long, ungainly tail of the mackinaw hid heavy belts with their worn black holsters and the long old .45s at his hips. Compared to Bull Sheldon, Rip looked almost like a young sky pilot seeking a congregation to which he might bring righteousness. He was tall and lean, and dressed in dead black save for a white shirt with a shiny black string tie sprayed down the broad bosom. His forehead was high and fair, his eyes were amazingly blue and clear, though capable of turning to a poisonous green when anger riled him to the fighting stage. The long tails of his Prince Albert also hid heavy belts and black-butted .45s. Men never failed to glance at least twice at Rip and Bull Sheldon when they were seen together. The two had boarded the train at Gun Creek Junction at daylight. Their horses, a pair of fine black geldings, had been loaded into a boxcar ahead. Even then Bull Sheldon had been 3 sheets in the wind, and all during the hot long day he had continued to drink. At Blowing Horn Rock, a little station 30 miles north of Gun Creek Junction, had been forced to drag his partner out of a fight bodily. He was virtually riding herd on Sheldon now, but he was doing it unobtrusively, being a man who knew his business and how to take care of it without outside help. And if he ain't stole horses, Sheldon was suddenly coming back to life with a dry chuckle, then neither his ma or his pa had a strain running too close to horses, beaglehounds or the doodlebugs. "Quiet." Rip rammed him with his elbow again. "Keep your lip to yourself. Nobody's bothering you." The train slowed down. It was always slowing down. It stopped everywhere, for anything from a couple of beef yearlings to be loaded for Badland to some lone passenger beside the tracks who simply wanted to ride up the line a mile or two. Hours of chugging, squeaking and jerking along had carried it to the high summit of the pass. The air would grow warmer as it started down the long slope. By daylight Badland would be at hand. "If and when this train ever gets there," grunted Sheldon, thinking aloud. "They tell me this whole shebang was abandoned for nigh 10 years before they struck oil on the poison. The way she jars and jolts a man, I reckon they ain't fixed no track since some rooster in a plug hat drove the Silver Spike the day they started to build the road out of Gun Creek. What are we stopping for now? Who for, human?" "I don't know, I don't care." A growl was beginning to make itself known in his voice. "Keep your mouth shut, Bull. You look better with it closed." "Same thing Ma used to say back in Missouri," grinned Sheldon. "Hi there, Chief Hair on the Belly. Do you want a little drink?" The Indian turned and looked at him, and tried to silence him with a glowering scowl. It was the beginning of what might have been trouble. Sheldon did not like the looks of that scowl. He jerked to his feet before Rip could catch him and started to push his way out in the aisle. But the train decided otherwise. It started with a jerk that threw Sheldon off his feet. He went down in a pile. Before he could get up, there was a roar that shook the train. The old kerosene lamps went out. Everybody was thrown from his seat, and in the sudden confusion and wild yelling the thunder of shots started, and bullets came whistling and crying into the old express baggage and smoker. Women screamed in panic-stricken voices in the rear coach. The shotgun guards yelled like men suddenly gone crazy. They were so absolutely terrified they did not know which way to turn to flee. Two of them whirled on their heels and fell dead in the end of the coach before they had time to snatch up their shotguns or draw six-shooters from their heavy belts. The ghost gangs robbing the train. Somebody yelled that in a high, thin wail above the roar of the shots and the splattering of the bullets. "Don't try fighting back. For God's sake, don't. They'll kill everybody." Had caught Bull Sheldon just in time. He knew how to manhandle a drunk to bring him quickly to his senses, and in the darkness he slammed his right fist straight to Sheldon's jaw, knocking him back and down between the seats. With his heavy guns unholstered now, Rip was waiting, hoping to get a chance to open fire on the mysterious men outside in the darkness. Chapter 2. Not yet did know just what had happened. The roar that shook the train had sounded like an explosion. In the shooting he could hear planks being ripped off the door of the express and baggage end of the old coach. A minute later he heard men cursing and storming in that part of the car. He growled an order to Sheldon and started to ease forward in the excitement. "Keep down, you damned fool. We'll take our time. Stay here." He was about to step into the aisle when bullets started splintering through the door ahead of him. Another guard let out a wail and fell backward, caught through the chest with a heavy slug of lead that had brought a wild shower of flying splinters from the door. To go forward now was impossible. Rip again backed in between the seats, and was just in time to catch the drunken Sheldon and knock him down once more. "Hair on the belly hit me," yelled Sheldon. "The son of a gun. I'll make him." "Shut up," snapped Rip, his voice a thunder of command above the yelling. "It's a train holdup. Keep down unless you want to stop lead." It seemed less than a minute before the train was starting again. Rip had heard heavy blows being delivered by some powerful hammer beating on the strong box in the forward compartment. Now the payroll had been snatched up, and the robbers were leaving the train. Rip got his chance a few seconds later. He saw a shadowy figure shooting into the side of the train as the cars started gliding on. He fired twice, heard a fierce yell ring out in a screech of pain, and saw the shadowy figure stagger backward and go down in a heap in the darkness. Then the old train was holding everybody's interest. It was no longer a crawling, jerking rattle-trap groaning its way up the long, winding grades. It was going down grade now, and the throttle of the old locomotive seemed to be wide open. It sobered even the bombastic Bull Sheldon. It sobered everybody. A woman screamed again in the rear coach. Men swore loudly. The train struck a sharp curve. The sudden swaying threw everybody from the right side of the car to the left. They came like spilling water, every man clawing like a terrified wild cat in a cage and yelling and cat squalling at the top of his lungs. In the mess somewhere Chief Hair of the Dog was letting out a war whoop. Then another curve was at hand. Now everybody was being hurled to the right side of the coach in that same hopeless flood of helpless humanity. "Now I know it's Noah's Ark," bawled Sheldon somewhere in the confusion. "We're right now hitting the waves of the deluge." Knowing that the engineer and fireman of the train had either gone crazy or had deserted the train, Rip was struggling forward. Men seemed to hurl themselves against him in the darkness. He was knocked to his knees before he could reach the door to the forward compartment. Then the door swung open ahead of him and he saw that one of the smoky old kerosene lights in the compartment was still in its battered brass bracket overhead. One glance was enough to show him what had happened in the compartment. Someone had thrown a bomb against the side door to the right, shattering it into splinters. A heavy iron box stood with its thick lid lifted against the wall to the right. A heavy sledge lay in front of it with the battered and broken remains of 3 powerful locks scattered on the floor. A groan came from the corner. In the wavering light of the oil lamp, Rip saw the forms of 3 men huddled against the wall. One was the body of the train's conductor. He had been shot squarely through the head. Just beyond him lay the brakeman, and beyond the brakeman, huddled against an old trunk, was the expressman with both hands gripped to the pit of his stomach and blood oozing through his fingers. "Where are the guards?" yelled Rip. "And what's happening that the train seems to be running away?" "I don't know." The expressman spoke gaspingly. "Guards usually run out when the ghost gang hits us." There was nothing just then that Rip could do for the man. He was a short, heavy-set fellow. Already his eyes were bulging in their sockets from pain, and his face was bloodless save for 2 bright red streaks seeping down from the corners of his mouth and dripping in huge drops from his chin. Rip moved on, conscious now that other men were coming into the car behind him. He reached the swaying and bouncing platform and had to grab the brake wheel to keep from being hurled off the train. It was all crazy now. At any moment the rattle-trap cars might start leaving the rails. They were rolling faster and faster. More hairpin curves were at hand, the cars whizzing around them, the wheels screaming a hellish lament on the old rails. Rip caught the iron rungs of the ladder on the end of a cattle car in front of him. He started up, swaying from side to side. The roar around him was deafening. He reached the top of the car. On his hands and knees he started forward, holding onto the half-rotted planks of the walkway along the top of the car. Cattle bawled in terror beneath him. Then it was horses squealing in the second car. He recognized the snorting of his horse and Sheldon's when he reached the top of the third car. Then something touched him from behind. He whirled and looked around as if a ghost had tagged him, and saw that Bull Sheldon was following him along the swaying walkway. "Keep going," yelled Sheldon, who seemed remarkably sober now. "That horsehead and his fireman flunky up there in the engine must have jumped off the train and let everything go to glory. We've got to stop this whole damn shebang or we'll all be ruined." Rip tried to run. He fell twice and just managed to grab the planks of one of the walkways in time to keep from being hurled from the top of the car as the train struck another curve. He looked around for Sheldon, and saw that the man was still following him. They kept on and made better progress as the track straightened for a mile. It was Rip's one big chance. He was like a running wolf now, with the long tails of his coat flapping and his feet pounding like pistons. He reached the end of the last car and jumped to the tender of the locomotive just as another curve loomed ahead and the guard rails below started screaming that awful lament against the flying wheels. Sprawling down through the coal in the tender, Rip reached the cab of the locomotive. The engineer was still on his seat, a grotesque figure crowded forward and half hanging out the window. The throttle was jerked wide open. Rip caught it, slammed it closed, and then reached for the air brake valve. He switched its short throttle to the right and left to see which way it worked. He found that it was to the right, and now he started applying the air and letting it escape to keep from bringing the train to a sudden halt that might throw it off the track. "What's the matter with the horsehead?" yelled Sheldon, floundering down through the coal in the tender and pointing at the engineer. "And where's the fireman?" "The poor devil has been shot," Rip yelled back. The hold-up gang must have made the fireman jump for it. The air was doing wonders to the old train by this time. Brake shoes were screeching and chattering back there. Sparks of fire were flying from the wheels. Rip kept applying the air. He was learning how to work the air valve properly by this time. Instead of trying to lock all wheels, he was bringing the train to a gradual halt. It kept on, crossed a swaying old trestle, and gradually groaned to a stop on the rim of a big plateau overlooking a deep valley to the west. "And now we'll go back and see what's happened. If you're sober enough to walk when the belly of the excitement is over." Rip turned from the seat and glowered at his companion. The man was staring at something hunched under an old tarpaulin beyond the end of the fireman's seat. He reached forward and clawed back the canvas. It was the unconscious figure of the fireman, a short, thin-faced man. He had evidently tried to hide himself. Somebody had seen him in the act, and now there was a blood-dripping bullet hole in the man's side. Sheldon dragged him forward and stretched him out on his back on the apron of the cab. "Poor devil never had a show, I reckon," growled Sheldon. "Still alive, though. How's the horse head?" "Bad. He may make it through, but it looks doubtful unless we get a doctor mighty quick." Rip had already examined the engineer. The man was alive, but still unconscious. There was a gaping bullet hole in his chest, and the blood was still oozing from it when Rip and Sheldon dragged the limp figure from the seat and straightened him out beside the fireman. "It's about all we can do for him just now." Rip straightened and turned toward the right side of the cab. "I don't know whether I can take this train into Badland or not, but we'll have to try it. I can pull this train." A soft voice spoke out of the darkness, and Rip and Sheldon saw the blonde head of a tall, slender girl as she came climbing up in the cab. "I'm Beth Luft. My father owns this railroad, if you can call it that. I'll show you how to fire and how to keep up the steam." Rip stepped forward to help her when he noticed that she was struggling with two heavy suitcases. The girl hesitated, ere a quick look of fear filled her eyes as Rip's hand closed on the handle of the suitcases. She shook his hand off and held on to them herself, moving quickly to the engineer's seat. Placing the suitcases carefully in front of her, she reached for the whistle cord to send two quick, sharp blasts out in the night as a signal that the train was going to start. "Now bail in the coal," she told Rip. "Keep the fire as level as you can, and keep this old pot steaming. I'll handle the water and I'll take us through as well as any man could." Rip stared at her. Big, deep blue eyes looked back at him briefly, and then she was attending to her job, seemingly frightfully anxious to get the train rolling again. Her right hand moved forward. It was like the hand of an old-timer when it closed on the throttle of the air valve. The left hand reached up as if it was used to handling that long steam throttle. She cracked it. The engine trembled. The exhaust coughed in the stumpy smokestack. Again she blasted out two sharp wails from the whistle, and the train with its dead and wounded was on the move again. Chapter 3. Beth Luft. Well, she was as slender as a reed, and dangerously attractive to a man who had always managed to keep women and girls out of his life. Rip kept thinking that. There was something about the girl that made a man keep watching her. She was so certain of herself, perched up there on a leather-covered seat, her hand gripping the long throttle, the blue eyes sparkling, her lovely face flushed with excitement. The yet unconscious figures of the fireman and the engineer had been placed on the tender with the old tarpaulin wrapped around them, and the girl maintained her air of assurance as the train rattled on through the darkness. Her feet on the suitcases, she was making that little tallow pot of a locomotive snort and sing. By the grace of God or whoever ruled such things, Rip and the grunting and perspiring Bull Sheldon were keeping up the steam, and the girl was doing what railroad men would have called balling the jack with the train. The train was no longer creeping and crawling. Beth Luft was slamming at Badland Ward through the night. Trestles that seemed a mile high in the air roared under them. The rails popped and sang like stringed instruments, the rail joints clicking and clacking as if to keep time with the singing. A deserted depot loomed out of the night. The engine roared past and it was gone like a black ghost of a thing hurling by on wings with one long, screaming blast of the whistle to hurry it along its departing way. "I always wanted me a job pulling a train," cackled Sheldon. "Sitting on a seat and riding her with my teeth in the wind." He was doomed to change his mind, at least temporarily. He kept bobbing back and forth from the fireman's seat, occasionally ramming his head out the window, his 2 rows of tobacco-stained snags hissing in the wind. He was up there when the sweeping ray of the headlight flew around a curve and suddenly showed a herd of sheep ahead. It was not the girl's fault. She reached instantly for the whistle cord and cracked the valve to the brass bell. The little locomotive was suddenly changed from what might have been a chuckling and fast-scratching hen to a screaming monster. The bell was clanging furiously, and Beth Luft was doing something with that whistle. The jerky, ear-splitting blasts of it were enough to chill a man's spine. It startled the sheep, split the herd. "All gone except 2, yelled Sheldon, still grinning. "They're heading up the track to make it a race. Port to them, gal. This is the first time I've ever seen a dad-blamed sheep right where I want it." Sheep were something Sheldon hated worse than poison. The grin became an evil leer. The train was gaining rapidly. There was no time to shut it down. Sheldon's eyes gleamed when he saw the first sheep go down and under. But horror filled his face when the second sheep went up in the air and burst like a bomb in front of the engine. An instant later a flying chunk of the sheep slapped Sheldon in the face and sent him rolling off the fireman's seat and sprawling down on the apron of the cab with a dazed look in his eyes. "Sheep?" he growled as he stumbled up and hurriedly mopped his face. "If a man done that to me," he glowered at the girl, "I would have got shot him sure as hell." They roared on. Hairpin curves rocked them. It was a railroad through the wildest hills a man could imagine. Most of the grades were downgrades now, just as they had been mostly upgrades south of Blacksmith Pass, and where the train had labored and grown south of the pass, the little engine was scooting it along now like a wild mare with the reins in her teeth. The girl kept her left hand on the throttle, opening and closing it. Now and then her right hand was busy with the air brakes. The wind had spilled her hair down her back, making it like a golden banner beating in the wind. Often she turned her head. Rip saw her look quizzically at him and the grinning monkey on the fireman's seat that had now started to sing some half-forgotten tune. Dawn came at last. It was like a rocket of gray cracking the blue-black heavens of the eastern sky. Like a long, streaking finger the light shot across the sky. It grew into a widening belt looking down on frowning black hills, mile-deep canyons and fertile valleys beneath snow-capped peaks jumping out of the darkness like ghoulish shapes with shining crowns. In the growing light the train was like a smoking serpent, the sweeping ray of the headlight waning in the growing daylight. Hellgate Gap came now. It was a little place 15 miles south of Badland, a lonely cattle shipping point perched on the frowning rim of a mile-deep canyon in the black V of 2 towering shoulders of mountains. Here was a station agent and telegraph instruments to send messages up and down the line, the first opportunity for such a thing since Blacksmith Pass. The agent stood in front of the shack of a depot, a tall scarecrow of a figure, his uncropped mop of hair blowing willy-nilly in the wind. Rip thought that the girl would at least slow down the train. He saw her crack the throttle a few notches wider. The little locomotive already seemed to be flying. It jerked into a faster run. The girl sawed down on the whistle cord, filling the mountains and hills with one lonesome blast of sound. Then Hellgate Gap was at hand, and Rip saw the girl lean far out the window as she released the whistle cord. He heard her scream to the startled agent. "Telegraph ahead. Robbery. Have doctors meet the train." Then Hellgate Gap was gone with the scarecrow figure running into telegraph. Another bridge loomed. The train hurled across it as Rip bailed in the coal. The girl kept that hand of iron on the throttle, and Sheldon grinned his black-toothed grin out the side. It was hills and more hills now. For 10 miles they loomed, and then they were falling away. Poison River came in sight, a long, shining snake of a stream worming its meandering way down the great coffin box valley of the Rockies. On the western rim of it the boomtown showed ahead at last. Badland was hardly more than a great hole in the earth. Ramshackle houses filled it. New lumber shone. Oil derricks stood like black skeletons and spidery shapes casting weird shadows on the ground from the first rays of the rising sun. Even from the distance it looked like a mean, gun-fighting hole spread over sparse, shale-strewn earth that had already gained a reputation far and wide as 60 acres of hell and bloody damnation. The journey's end. The girl's voice was dog-tired, and Rip looked up at her quickly. Already she had closed the throttle. The little train was shuffling into Badland and the grimy depot on the eastern side of the track. A crowd was there, lining the cindered platform. Among the men were doctors and nurses. Beth Luft allowed the locomotive to glide on. As it passed the depot a tall, black-haired man of 50 swung aboard. "This is my father," explained the girl simply. "I don't know the names of these men, Dad, but they helped to bring the train through. And it was robbed again." The man's voice was almost a scream. "They hid it somewhere." "Just after leaving Blacksmith Pass," cut in the girl wearily. "But this time we fooled them with iron washers and wads of paper. The payroll is under my feet. I brought it through. It worked, Dad, having me planted in the compartment next to the engine." Chapter 4. Shouts, cries, and yells set the pace for the next half hour as dead and wounded were hurriedly unloaded from the train. Badland was like a town gone raving crazy with excitement. Rip and Bull Sheldon were completely forgotten in the noise and confusion. William Luft, the girl's father, had gripped their hands, mumbled something in a trembling voice, and had ushered the girl away with the heavy suitcases. The downcountry engineer of the twice-a-week train service between Badwater and Gun Creek Junction took charge of the engine. Soon the ears were being switched to a siding, and Rip and Sheldon went to see about their horses. The boxcar the animals were in was shunted in beside a cattle pen, and the horses were unloaded. It was while Rip and Sheldon were saddling that Rip noticed a group of men standing at the edge of the crowd on the cindered platform of the depot. Even as Rip studied the group he saw a huge, moon-faced man in gray push forward. He had a glittering star on his buckskin vest and a pair of silver-mounted six-shooters at his bulging hips. "I think," frowned Rip, watching the man from the corners of his eyes, "that the Honorable Law is now coming forward to ask us a few questions." "I'll do all the talking, Bull." "Go to it, and it'll please me," growled Sheldon. "I never did take pleasure in talking to a law squirt. They more or less gagged me worse than the mutton did when the gal slapped the sheep into 40 chunks with the doodle-doo." The lawman was coming on. At his heels were 7 other men, one of them being a tall, shaggy-looking fellow with buck teeth, a long, hooked nose, and huge black eyes. He wore the star of a deputy sheriff on his vest and he had a pair of black-butted .45s at his hips. "Name's Wright," announced the big man when he strode up and came to a halt 10 feet away with his little mob behind him. "Virgil Wright, Sheriff of Badland. I'd like to talk with you fellows. Miss Luft gave you a fine send-off for your help, but she doesn't know very much about you. Not enough to suit me. As sheriff of this town, I like to have something I can tie to when strangers blow in." Considering all the floaters that must come and go in Badland, the hint of a grin streaked Rip's face. "Hunting things to tie to among them must keep you a very busy man, right?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "At times it does. But, to be damned plain about it, that's my business, mister, so don't get smart. Where are you men from? What are your names? What are you doing in Badland? How long do you expect to stay? Have you money enough to keep you?" The questions were as quick as a cracking .45. "And does anybody in Badland outside of Miss Luft know who you are?" "Gun Creek Junction." Rip's answers were made in the same clipped tone. "Rip and Sheldon. Saddling a couple of horses. Don't know yet. Not on charity." "Nobody." "Smart fellow," snapped the sheriff. "2 of them," put in Sheldon, squirting a streak of tobacco spittle close to the big man's feet and hitching up his old cartridge belts. "You maybe sort of forget that I'm here." "All right, that's fine." The sheriff took a step backward, a peculiar smile hardening across his face. "We like smart people in Badwater. Some get along, and some don't." "What line of work?" The eyes again narrowed as he looked back at Rip. "Do you men follow?" "Cattle or horses," answered Rip. "You might pass for a cowpuncher." The sheriff eyed him up and down. "I'd say, however, that you look more like a gambling man. That goes only for you. As far as your partner, He looks like a sheep herder and might even be able to slop horses if the directions for spilling the swill were written on the bottom of the bucket. Why, the horse-eyed son of a polecat. I'll jar your easy, you. Rip caught Sheldon just in time. He jerked him back and stepped toward the lawman. And you might go a little easy, too. He looked straight into the sheriff's eyes. Instead of standing here trying to pick a row with us, you might be trying to round up the ghost gang for shooting men down in cold blood and attempting to rob that train last night. Now just a minute. Cut in the sheriff, his face suddenly red with anger. I'm the law here, the whole law, and the only damned law in Badland. I know my business. I have a right to browbeat people, yes. Rip cut in coldly. Well, save it for someone else, right? I don't like your looks, and if my nose tells me anything, you stink of something that's been dead too long and left out in the weather without the benefit of a proper funeral. Let's go, Bull. It was an insult when Rip turned to his horse and swung himself into his big saddle. The sheriff stared, his mouth sagging open with surprise. Sheldon grinned and swung himself into his saddle. They turned the horses abruptly and rode on across the tracks, leaving the glowering lawman too amazed to speak. And that's the way you usually do it, chuckled Sheldon. Get us both in bed the first day in a town. Some people can't keep out of hot water, and you're one of them. We came to Badland to get in trouble. So I'm kind of suspecting. A hard grin crossed Sheldon's face. Still, I ain't yet plumb horse-wild about this town. It was a mean hole when they reached the main street. The stench of oil filled the air. Oil derricks were everywhere. Ragged tents and new board houses were jammed into every conceivable spot. Here and there were tents, some of them gambling and drinking dives, others dance halls. Gunmen all around. Bull. Rip spoke from the side of his mouth as they turned up the street. A nice town. You'll like it before you're here very long. Well, again I'm saying you was the one that wanted to come to Badland, and again I say here you are. It was hours later when Bull Sheldon growled that in a dingy room over the old livery stable on the west side of the main street, a bare-walled, dirt-streaked window of a room with lean-to bunks against the wall. It was costing the two men $4 a day for a place to hang their hats in this hole in the western bank of the Poison. Ham and eggs for two hungry men had been $1 a throw. By main strength, Rip had kept Sheldon out of the saloons. He had sauntered up and down the dive-infested street and had found Badland looking more and more like the devil before daylight. The only thing I've seen so far, Sheldon growled on, that sort of takes a shine to my honorable eye and kind of gives me a tickling in my brisket is the little chunk of sweetness up the street with the 12-foot bull snake wrapped round her neck. Rip nodded. He had seen the chunk of sweetness at the upper end of the street where the gaudy canvas walls and roofs of a huge street carnival occupied a place of business like the spread-out tents of some wild Arabian caravan at the head of the town. Snake charmers were a weakness with Mr. Bull Sheldon. The fatter they came the better he liked them. The one Rip had seen looked half as large as the red striped tent behind her. Her eyes were a bilious green, and her cheeks two great pumpkins. A woman like that would go a long way with Bull Sheldon. She might even keep him from drinking. She's a beauty, no doubt, Rip admitted with a straight face. But you wouldn't get along with her. She's not your type. And why not, know it all? I heard her say she couldn't stand a man with the odor of whiskey on his breath. That being the case, frowned Sheldon, vile whiskey and me are quitting company here and now. It won't be hard. If I've swore off once, I've swore off 1,000 times. What do you reckon become of our little engineer? Rip did not know. He had seen nothing more of the girl since her father had ushered her away from the train. But he had heard about her. Badland was still talking about the ghost gang's unsuccessful raid and the slender girl who had brought the payroll through with every dollar of it intact. The attack on the train was the fourth in a matter of 5 months. All the other raids had been successful. Men had been killed, ruthlessly shot down. Payrolls had been snatched up, and the ghost gang had vanished as if the riders were only specters who came like evil shades, did their lawless work with lightning swiftness, and then disappeared like shadows of a dark night fleeing before the rising of a morning sun. Rip had listened to all the talk he could, and he had said nothing. Not yet did even Bull Sheldon know exactly why they had come to Badland after they had been hanging around Gun Creek Junction for more than a week. They had gone to Gun Creek Junction after a fast job far down in the hills of a job that had knocked the horns and daylight out of a full-grown range war. They had left between suns, like a couple of outlaws making a fast getaway, but they had left on two of the best saddle horses two gray-bearded old cattlemen could give them. Certain things in that range war had not been strictly ethical from the law's viewpoint. 4 rustlers had been strung to the limbs of cottonwoods as the brains behind the war that had brought hatred and exploding gunpowder between 2 old men who had been made the dupes of a gigantic stealing scheme. One Rip and one yowling bull Sheldon had taken it upon themselves to shoulder all the blame for the hangings, and peace had been restored to the range. The gratitude of the two owners had been expressed in the form of good horseflesh which had carried them northward well ahead of the law. For 5 years Rip had trailed with bull Sheldon. They were two fighting gun hawks who had been to hell together many times in the past. Together they had fought through the fumes and burning brimstone no less than a dozen times, and had always managed to live to tell the tale. But a man had to be devilishly careful about bull Sheldon. He was a barnstorming, belly-bursting fool in a fight, as arrogant as a bull, always ready to mix it with friend or foe, and yet the old devil was a man who never lost a friend after he once had made one. "I'm still kind of dry behind the gills." Sheldon looked at Rip now with one of his sheepish grins. "And you're riding fast herd on me for some reason. What are we supposed to do here?" "I didn't say we were supposed to do anything, bull." "Don't need to," frowned Sheldon. "But I know. We was nigh busted flat in Gun Creek, and then you show up with a belt chock full of money and high airs of shipping horses on the train. If I was young and innocent, I'd kind of suspect you of several things, but one of them wouldn't be that you've hooked us up with the ghost gang." "Keep your shirt tail down," ordered Rip, "and keep out of trouble. Don't go around looking for it. Plenty will come before we're done. And stay away from whiskey. Get that straight. Keep away from it." "Now that Pansy May on my mind, I reckon I will," Sheldon said amicably. "Who the hell is Pansy May?" demanded Rip. "Is she the snake-charming whale of Hargrove and Hornblower's greatest and most stupendous attractions on the face of the earth?" "She ain't no damned whale," retorted Sheldon, suddenly turning pale around the mouth. "She's what a man might call scrumptious. She's a lady. To you, she's Miss Dooley, or maybe it's Mrs. I ain't gone that far yet. But she's got me. You know how scared I am of reptiles, but I've done already patted her bull snake. She calls him Oscar. It made me crawl inside to pat that damn snake, but I done it. When a man goes a-romancing he ain't got no right to be timid. He's got to waltz right up where he's to smell the smoke and be ready to stand and fight or kick off his boots and run. She's the chunkiest little chunk of smiling sweetness an old bat like me ever sashayed up aging. When I clamped eyeballs on her, words started failing from my mouth like water from the rock Moses hit with his walking stick. 300 pounds of perfect." A noise from beyond the window cut him off. It was the sound of a shot, the heavy, dull thundering of a Colt. A yell came with it, and right after the first shot came another, then a third and a fourth, and then the yelling became a din punctuated by the flying pound of many hoofs racing madly down the street. "From the sounds," yelped Sheldon flinging from his chair and leaping toward the dirt-streaked window, "they must be moving hell and right now corning by with the first load." It looked as though he might be right when they reached the window and stared down at the street. They first saw an old man with white hair staggering across the street toward the hastily closed front door of a saloon, an old man in ragged gray with silvery hair and a pair of long-barreled .45s in his hands. They saw him go down to his knees, shake his head, and fire 2 quick shots at somebody up street, and then everything was blotted out by the roar of hoofs and the thunderous burst of wild shots, the yelling from angered riders, and the slap and smash of bullets with women screaming from the doorways of dives and turning to flee like cats suddenly frightened out of their wits. Chapter 5. Rip had never seen a tougher-looking crew than the 12 fighting men who came galloping down the street on half-outlaw horses with the dust boiling in a cloud around them. They were a hard-gutted crew, yet there was something about them that branded them as a clean-cut fighting gang. They swung on down the street and flung a circle around the silver-haired man who had now gone down to his hands and knees for a second time in front of the saloon. Rip saw one of the riders reach down and haul the old man to his feet, saw strong arms hurl the man up and across a lunging, snorting horse's saddle. Then the mob was sweeping on. They gunned their way down the street for 50 yards more, and now they were surrounding a buckboard with 4 big buzzard-head horses hitched to it in front of a general store. A girl had appeared, a tall, black-haired and hurrying figure dressed in a brown riding garb and carrying a 6-shooter at her hip. Rip saw her throw herself into the buckboard seat. He saw the men surround her. The rider with the old man across his saddle swung in closely, tossed his burden into the buckboard. Now the buckboard, loaded heavily with supplies from the store, was leaving town like hell on the rush. "They're shooting up the whole town," yelled Sheldon, excitement running away with him. "Let's unlimber our fighting tools and join the show." "Keep out of it, you old bat." Rip caught him just in time. "We don't yet know what it's all about. But Pansy May's liable to get killed. If she does they'll have to make 2 loads out of her to get her to the graveyard." Rip was actually enjoying the sight of 12 fighting horsemen shooting it out with an entire town. Who they were or what they were did not matter. They had a job on their hands, and they were men enough to tackle it. Rip saw two of them reel in their saddles as a burly black-bearded man appeared in the doorway of a saloon and opened fire on the crowd with a sawed-off shotgun. A split second later the black-bearded man was going down, a plunging figure rooting forward on his face with little puffs of dust flying from his clothes as 3 bullets struck him. "Hell, I'm beginning to like that bunch," bellowed Sheldon. "Whoever they are, they know how to smell the smoke and smile. And look. Look yonder at that old-eyed polecat of a deputy getting behind them for a shot. Look out behind you, fellas." Before Rip could stop him, Sheldon had thrown up the window, poked his head out of it, and was yelling to the horsemen. "Look behind you." Two of the riders whirled. They were just in time. 2 heavy .45s exploded in unison just as the deputy sheriff was throwing up his Winchester to fire. Rip saw the lawman stagger backward, spin around, and plunge to the ground. "And now the gang's leaving town," yelled Sheldon. "Good luck to you." He yelled that in a louder voice. One of the riders turned in his saddle and waved to him. Then they were gone, the drum of hoofs sounding like a cyclone, and 3 of the men now hanging low over their saddle horns as the gang sped on after the departing buckboard going over a rise in the distance. "And now we'll probably hear something more from the law," exclaimed Rip as they turned away from the window. "I believe they call it aiding and abetting a criminal to yell like you did and get a deputy killed when he was about to shoot other men in the back. What do you reckon they was fighting about? You'll probably find out." Rip was already at the door. "Come on." He led the way down the musty stairs and out the front door of the old stables. A glance up and down the street told him that the war had been even worse on Badland than it had looked from the window. "It was the Singing Organ Pass gang," exclaimed a tall, hook-nosed cowboy from one of the surrounding rangelands. "That was old Silver Dan himself that they downed. Bud Strat, the big fella lying over there in front of the saloon, started it from behind. Didn't give Silver Dan no show at all. Bud's killer Virgil Wright's crack gunman, or was until now. But I'll bet, by gosh, that Wright's tricky law crowd wish they hadn't started it. They might have known the main gang was lying back waiting and watching the show as the old man and his gal come in to do their buying." "But who's this Silver Dan?" demanded Rip as the crowds gathered and people started running to dead and sorely wounded men lying in the street and doorways. "You don't know Silver Dan Cruz and his gang?" The cowboy looked him up and down with contemptuous surprise. "I'm a stranger in town," explained Rip quietly. "Just got in this morning." "Oh." The contemptuous look on the cowboy's face turned to a grin. "Say, I know you and your partner now. I was at the depot when the train come in. You two are the pair what stopped the runaway engine and helped Beth Luft bring in the train." He thrust out a big, rope-gnarled hand that had seen much hard service on the range. "I'm Slick Riley, 20 years out here all the way from Hatchettsburg, Missouri." "You didn't need to say the last," grinned Sheldon, thrusting out his hand. "The Missouri breed's most generally found in all places. Why'd you leave Hatchettsburg?" "My name's Sheldon. It's a long tale and a sad un." The cowboy grinned. "However, I eventually never forget a face. If you ain't the bull Sheldon I used to know back in Hatchettsburg, then I'm a liar. The name, ain't Bull." Rip saw that Sheldon was suddenly in a corner with this tall, rangy-looking cowboy. "It's, Seth Sheldon. I." "That being the case, I move forth for quick apology." The cowboy slapped him on the shoulder. "I reckon there ain't a Hatchettsburg Sheldon living, low down as they was, what'd like to have you call him Bull. He was the devil, horns and tail, hoof and fang of the gang. He was a low-down man, no doubt of it," admitted Sheldon, pinching Rip's arm for silence. "But if you're Seth," the cowboy was going on, "then surely you ain't forgot me, even if you and me have changed some in the run of years." "Your face is powerful familiar," admitted Sheldon weakly, "but names and faces slip me these days and—" "Like the $8.95 you owe me, maybe," said the cowboy cynically, "for helping you haul off a batch of hoofs one night. It was on account of them hoofs that I had to leave Missouri. The owner of them showed up after you sold them and left me to watch the wagon and team." "I think we'd better meet and talk later," Sheldon said uncomfortably, edging away in the crowd. "I never like to gas about the past in a whole mob of people." "Wait." Rip caught Slick Riley's arm as he started to follow Sheldon. "What about this Silver Dan? I forgot." The cowboy took off his hat and scratched his head as if trying to drag his thoughts back together. "They're Singing Organ Range folks, like I said. Hold all the range north of the pass. In bad with the law, and always have been, I reckon. They come in for supplies today, and Wright tried to wipe them out, as usual. Wright holds warrants for them for this and that, and of late he's been trying to say they're either the ghost gang or somehow mixed with it. Them what really know them swear by them, and you can bet they ain't done with this job. They'll come back. They always do." They always pay up for dirty tricks. They'll come, tear the lid off of hell, and there ain't 50 men who'd dare follow them back to their ranges. But I want to talk some more to Sheldon. That man sure reminds me of Bull. Where'd he go? I think you'll find him up at a snake pit talking to a red-headed whale, grinned Rip, letting him go and moving on with the crowds. In a minute he had forgotten Bull Sheldon and the fast-talking Slick Riley, who seemed to know entirely too much about Sheldon's past for that man's comfort. 4 men were dead and 4 others were seriously wounded. The singing organ crowd had literally blasted the devil out of the town, and the strange part of it was that half the people of Badland were now openly talking in favor of that fighting crew. "They don't bother folks unless folks bother them," growled a bewhiskered old cattleman. "Sides all that, Wright ain't got no business hiring gun buzzards what'll shoot from behind." "I like Silver Dan and his bunch," agreed another man. "I've been beyond the pass of singing organ a dozen times. Never was treated better in my life. But may the devil take you if you go there as anything but a friend." Rip saw Virgil Wright a few minutes later. No one knew where the man had been during the fight, but he was all law now. He rushed from one dead or wounded man to another, and soon the street was being cleared and some hint of quiet being returned to Badland. Marching on with the slowly dwindling crowds, Rip listened to all that was being said, and kept silent. He saw Wright trying to organize a posse, and he saw men bluntly refuse to ride with him. Evidently it was something new for the sheriff to get such a cold turndown. Men were threatened with being arrested for not aiding the law, and in 2 or 3 instances fights were narrowly avoided. But no posse was formed. This killer Virgil Wright was not liked in Badland except by a certain crowd. That was plain, and when Rip returned to the dingy room over the stables just before darkness settled, he had drawn his own picture of the lawman. Wright was a cold-blooded rat despite the star on his chest. A man would do well to watch him. Sitting there with his feet on the windowsill, Rip was smoking when the door opened behind him. He did not have to glance around. He knew the sounds of those footsteps, but there was something out of the ordinary about them. "So you're back." Rip spoke from the side of his mouth. "Got any hoofs with you?" "There was a plumb honest mistake in the matter," growled Sheldon. "Them Hatchetspur Rileys was never downright bright. I had another talk with Slick. He's all right now." "Ho-hum. I suppose you saw Pansy November again?" said Rip without looking around. "Pansy May is correct," Sheldon said lightly. "And I saw her, yeah." "Ho-hum." Rip did not like the sound of that second yawn. He turned around and his eyes bulged. The Bull Sheldon he had known only a couple of hours ago was not the same Bull Sheldon who had just entered the room. He had had a haircut and a shave, the latter adding a hellish pink to an already ruddy face and making it shine like a harvest moon. In addition he was dressed to kill. He wore a ginger-brown suit with broad lines of wide plaids, looking as if they had been drawn with rattlesnake venom. His battered hat was gone. In its place rode a high-riding black derby. Then Rip looked at his feet and saw the wonder of wonders. The run-over boots were gone. Instead, Sheldon wore a pair of dashing red sandals. "I can't believe what I'm seeing." Rip shook his head slowly, sadly. "It beats me." "What's wrong?" Sheldon got up, turned around, glanced into a cracked mirror on the wall, and grinned. "How do you like the duds? I spent quite a spell of that $80 you give me. Gentlemen need a change of clothes now and then." "Sit down, and shut up," ordered Rip. "Hell, I've never seen anything like it." "And neither have I," put in a voice from the doorway. "I can't bring myself to believe it yet." The door had swung open without a sound. Filling the opening stood Sheriff Virgil Wright with his silver-mounted 6-shooters in his hands. Behind him were 6 heavily armed men, and at either side of him, shoved forward so that their black muzzles covered the room, were sawed-off shotguns. "Take it easy." A wicked little grin streaked the sheriff's face. "You birds are under arrest. Reach for a gun and we'll blow you both to hell." Chapter 6. Sheldon glanced out of the corners of his eyes. If Rip had given him the merest hint of their old fighting signal, Bull Sheldon would have gone for his guns to shoot it out with that mob in the doorway. Even with those shiny 6-shooters of the sheriff covering them, even with those ugly muzzles of the shotguns leering in a man's face, Sheldon would have taken a chance. Memories flashed to him of situations just as critically hopeless as this, memories of places and times when he and had shot themselves out of traps where the drop of guns were upon them and it had seemed nothing short of foolhardy to take a fighting chance. But Rip surprised him. Sheldon got a glance at his eyes. They were cool and blue. There was even a twinkle in them. Not yet was that poisonous green beginning to show. Rip's lips had curled as if with anger, but the eyes were giving those curling lips the lie. Rip was actually pleased about this thing. Bull Sheldon could read it in his face. and Rip was still pleased when they were marched up the street to the old jail behind the carnival tents of Hargrove and Hornblower's greatest and most stupendous attraction on the face of the earth. It rankled Sheldon to the bone. Out of the corners of his eyes he could see the fuzzy red head of Pansy May showing above the canvas wall of the snake pit. It was not right. For a few moments anger at Rip filled Sheldon. He glowered at Rip, and then stared back at the ground as he plodded on. Had something up his devilish sleeve. That was certain. Bull Sheldon trusted him as he had trusted no other man. Through hell or high water, a man could swim with, and get along. For years before he had met him, Sheldon had never sat with his back to a window or a door. Rip had changed all that. A man could set any hell-fired place with a round to sort of keep an eye peeled on the doings. At times, when in an especially generous mood, Bull Sheldon gave Rip credit for having a few brains under that curling hair of his. At all times he gave him credit for being a man of iron, smooth-faced and rather dad-burned boyish, but all high, wide and handsome, a real man chock full of good old fighting sand. The thing to do now was to mosey along and keep one's mouth shut, but it gave Bull Sheldon a pain in the neck to have to do it. Virgil Wright had not taken their guns. There was some meaning to that play. Either this Wright was giving them a chance to go for those guns so that he could shoot them down, or he was just a plain damned fool. Sheldon could not see it as anything else. With one of Wright's men hurrying on to open the door, they crossed the short front porch of the jail, and were herded into the big, dingy office of the jail. Guns still covering them as they were backed into chairs against the wall, Wright strode onto his desk in the corner. "In a few minutes we'll see what we'll see," exclaimed the sheriff, easing his heavy guns down on the desk with their dark tubes of muzzles still covering his two prisoners. "I said I made it a point to talk to strangers, and I'll make you birds believe it before I'm through. What's your full name, fellow?" He looked at Sheldon. "Let's have it." "I only speak Russian," leered Sheldon. "My partner only speaks Greek. You look like a fellow what out to talk Latin." "Shut your mouth," snapped the sheriff. "When I look at you in that windcatcher derby and the pinned horse blanket of a $4 suit, I'm moved to pity. How long have you known Dan Cruz?" "He doesn't know him or anybody connected with him," said Rip. "I'm not talking to you." The sheriff's bullying voice could have been heard halfway down the street. "Keep your damned mouth shut. Now wait a minute." Rip was on his feet, and Sheldon saw the old poisonous green flame in his eyes. "We won't start out like this, right? I'm a man, and you're supposed to be, but don't try crowding me like this. You may have your mob of gun rats around you, but if anything starts you're the first man I'll kill." "Hard, eh?" sneered the sheriff, but Sheldon noticed that the blustering dash had gone out of him and his face had become a sickly yellow. "All right. Sit down. We'll talk. All I want is questions answered, and I usually get what I want." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. The questioning started then. Wright was as stubborn as a bull about it. Rip talked all right, but he was lying like a blue streak. Everything he was saying was a lie, and lying was one trick that did not belong to Rip. Sheldon sat there with a face as cold as marble and heard his partner admit that they were both just out of a penitentiary in the Southwest. He was playing this sucker. For long periods he seemed to be getting along splendidly with the lawman, then came breaks of anger. Wright was trying his best to tie Rip into a knot, but he was getting nowhere, and the amazing thing about it to Sheldon was the fact that Rip was really keeping his temper and actually leading the sheriff on and on with one lie after another. For an hour it was a seesaw of words, and finally the sheriff was exhausted. The man relaxed. He drew a pad toward him and picked up a pencil. For 5 minutes he was busy writing. Then he folded a letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and gave it to one of his men with some whispered words of instruction. The man, a short, thick-set gunman of the cold-blooded killer type if Sheldon had ever seen one, hastily left the office and hurried off down the street. 15 minutes later a man walked in. To Sheldon he looked exactly like a lion. He was a huge individual of 50-odd, a broad-shouldered and barrel-bellied man dressed in immaculate black. His upper lip was unshaven, but a red bull tail of beard swung from his chin and a fat cigar hung in the corner of his mouth. His hair was long, bushy, and reddish, and it looked like the mane of a lion. He wore no guns that Sheldon could see, but something told Sheldon that weapons were hidden somewhere inside that brawny bosom or under the tails of the man's long coat. "Well, I see that you brought them in," exclaimed the man, glancing from Sheldon to Rip, then back at the sheriff. "What do they know, Virgil? They don't talk very well." "Dr. Hargrove." The sheriff forced a thin smile. "I haven't really got right down to work on them yet. I know how to do it. I was once a guard in a prison mine, and we learned to use a bullwhip in those days. They're both under arrest." "Arrest?" The big man whirled, snatching the cigar out of his mouth. "For what?" His voice was suddenly harsh. Why? Well, stammered the sheriff, rising awkwardly, you said they might. Might? Hell, snapped Dr. Hargrove. I asked you to talk to every man and woman who came in on the train. I asked you to question them as to what they might be able to tell us of the ghost gang last night. Personally, I don't give a damn about the cruises merely as the cruises go. I just want to find out whether they have any connection with the ghost gang. Hargrove and Hornblower have offered a $20,000 reward for the arrest or the removal of that gang. My God, man, we can't even risk taking our shows out of Badland until the ghost gang is eliminated. And here you go, like a damned fool, dragging these men in here by the heels. I did what I thought best. The sheriff was snarling now. I tried to be a gentleman when I attempted to talk to them this morning. You wouldn't know how to be a gentleman at anything, right? Sheldon saw him get up. You're just a plain, ordinary damned fool with a star on your brisket. If this is all you want with us, we'll be going. You'll not be going just yet, gentlemen. To Sheldon's surprise, he saw Dr. Hargrove turn toward Rip with an outstretched hand. You'll first allow me to apologize for this unpardonable injustice. Chapter 7. Darkness was settling long before they left the jail. Bull Sheldon was still mystified. He could not understand Rip at all. He had even lied to Dr. Hargrove, and Hargrove was such a nice fellow. Shined right up to a man and took his part. The things Rip had told him and the sneering, browbeating sheriff were enough to get a man hanged in most places. And my name ain't Sheldon. That is, it ain't sure enough. Clem Patton. And your true name's Galloway, Bent Galloway. Where'd you get them names? Off a reward poster, answered Rip with a hint of a grin playing about the corners of his mouth. Galloway and Patton were wanted in Texas a few years ago. They were picked up, did a stretch in the pen just as I told Wright, and I suppose they're wanted elsewhere now. And maybe a reward on them, exclaimed Sheldon. How do you know there ain't? And what's to keep Wright from running us in his Who Scout to try and collect a little blood money? Why, damn it, you just about made them believe a couple of horse thieves would be fine dudes alongside of us. I don't understand you. Horse thieves, Rip spoke from the side of his mouth and in a low voice as they passed a group of men, might be far more welcome in Badland than a couple of plain troubleshooters, especially with one of the said troubleshooters sick on the brand of loco weed they call love. Lord, Bull, but you're a handsome dude in that getup you're wearing. Let's go by and see the horse. What horse? The one in the snake pit, grinned Rip. Not just yet, growled Sheldon. I wanted to get a little more used to these duds I'm wearing. Brand new glad rags make a fella feel kind of stiff until he knocks about in them a little. I think I'm going to have the seat of the pants let out a little. I cracked them when I stooped over a while ago. They were both hungry again, and they headed down the street. They turned in at Mag's, a place on the east side of the street, and Rip headed for a quiet table in the shadowed southeast corner of the long room where there would be no window or door immediately behind them. And now what's the lowdown? Demanded Sheldon in a low tone when they were starting on their steaks. You've got something up your sleeve. Let's air it a little. How much have you told your pansy onesie about us? Demanded Rip in a low tone. Look here now, Sheldon growled. I may look like a fool, act like a fool, and I may even be a fool, especially with my running ground with you, but I don't tell my women everything I know. Pansy May knows me only as a sort of a hotshot heart smasher what drifted boldly into her sweet young life today. I expect to court her bride and swoonful, and marry her, if and when she gives up snakes and wants to settle down with a gentleman. That is, I expect it if I don't find you doing something to get us both run out of town without a chance to say goodbye, as per usual. Well, we're just about due to get run out. I don't get you, frowned Sheldon. You're acting like a fool and talking like two of them. Talk about the weather, ordered Rip, glancing up as he saw three burly men with heavy guns at their hips walk in at the front door and glance over the room as if spotting everything in it before seating themselves to order coffee at the head of the counter. I believe I fooled nobody but you when we were playing around with Killer Virgil Wright. Wright's smart in his crude way and won't wait long before going into action on us. Keep that in mind and stay out of dark alleyways. Monday's going to be a big day in this town, he went on after a short pause to glance again at the three men who had walked in. Monday's payday. Today would be the logical time, I suppose, but Monday's the time. I've got it that it's William Luff's orders. He owns and controls a lot here, and he set Monday as payday to get away from the Saturday night and Sunday sprees of his oil crowd that leaves half of them unable to go to work Monday morning. There's to be plenty of drinking tonight, plenty going on right now, but you're doing well, thanks to your pansy May. We've got a job on our hands. It's the toughest we've ever tackled. Before he could say anything else, Slick Riley walked in at the back door over near the stove. Slick hesitated, glanced at the men at the other end of the long counter, and spoke in a guarded tone from the side of his mouth. "Watch yourselves." He walked on without another word, but there was the trace of a grin on his range-tanned face as he glanced from Rip and Sheldon to the dangerous-looking men up the counter. Halfway to the head of the counter, Riley halted and spoke to the thin-faced night waiter in a casual tone. "Ain't seen Tick Jones or any of the rest of the boys from the Flying Crow in tonight, have you, Scooter?" "Nary one, Slick," answered the waiter. "I reckon they might blow in later." "Hope so." Riley grinned. "If they do, tell them I'm looking for them." The cowboy moved on. Rip saw him nod indifferently to the three men hunched over their coffee, and one of the men turned and eyed him with a frown as he passed on out the door. "Your friend," whispered Rip, "seems to be on our side of whatever the game is." "Slick would be," nodded Sheldon, "whatever you're talking about. I had to tell him I'm Bull Sheldon or fight him or pay $8.95 for Cousin Seth's horse rustling. All them hatch at Spur Riley's was plumb bullheaded when they thought you owed them money." They ate in silence after that, but Rip kept watching the men at the counter. The three toyed over their coffee as long as they could and kept glancing toward Rip and Sheldon with ill-concealed malice in their faces. Now and then Rip could tell that they were talking in low voices about him and Sheldon when the waiter moved away from them. Finally they rose, hitched up their belts, and strolled out. Neither of them glanced back until they were out the front door, and then Rip caught the flash of a turned face over a shoulder and a leering smile of white teeth. "And now we duck it," exclaimed Rip as he motioned for the waiter to pay the check at the table instead of going to the head of the counter. "I think the play's about to be made." "But I still don't understand," began Sheldon. "Here you go, trouble seeming to be oozing up on us for some unknown reason, and you even act like you might for once duck a fight and—" "Keep quiet," ordered Rip. "We're going out the back door. Watch yourself as we go and be ready to reach for your guns." But they had barely reached the back door before they saw the trick that had been played upon them. Rip had just started to step out into the darkness when the shots roared. There were two gashing streaks of flame lurching at him from the corner of a rundown old hut 50 feet behind the restaurant. One bullet struck just overhead, smashing into the casing and bringing down flying splinters. The other hit the side of the door, glanced on inside and ripped through a pile of dishes on the counter, bringing a fierce screech of sudden terror from the waiter. Then Rip and Sheldon were throwing themselves out in the darkness with their six-shooters filling their hands. For an instant Rip was sure that Slick Riley had played his own little part in the trick. The three burly gunmen had deliberately brought attention to themselves, showing by the leers on their faces that they were looking for trouble. They had drawn attention to the front of the building. Any man would have expected them to be waiting on the makeshift strip of board sidewalk just beyond the front door, and any man wanting to avoid trouble even for the moment would have stepped out the back door. And here was the trap, all set and springing. But there was no time now to think about it. A third and a fourth gash of fire came lunging out of the shadows of the hut, and Rip and Sheldon were suddenly returning the fire with their guns blazing and their roars filling the night with their far-rolling reports. There could not have been a better man in a fight than Bull Sheldon. Rip had never fought shoulder to shoulder with a man who could take care of himself so well. Sheldon was like a dipping and darting bullbat, a man rocking to the right and left, the hard hat bobbing, reddish hands whipping his guns. A man went sprawling down beside the hut, a tall, gangling figure in dark clothes. Claw-like hands and long arms flung out at either side of him, and a pair of six-shooters bounced on the ground. Then Sheldon was killing the second man. A shot from the heavy Colt in Sheldon's right hand sped a bullet forward, one that caught the would-be murderer high in the forehead. The man came careening out of the darkness like a bag going limp in a wind. Before he could strike the ground, Sheldon had drilled him through and through with 3 more bullets. "All right, duck it now," Rip spat the words out of the side of his mouth in a cold, hard voice as the roar of the last shot died away. "Come on. This job's finished." "Not if I can see another bahunk to shoot at," snarled Sheldon. "I don't like for men to ambush at me from the dark." "Come on, damn it." Rip holstered one of his six-shooters and caught him by the arm, giving him a jerk. "Get the hell out of here, and make it fast." "This way, Bull," put in a third voice, and Slick Riley's lean figure stepped out of a narrow alleyway. "I cut back when I heard the guns going off. Come on. If you stick here half the gun buzzards in town might get a notion to drop on your necks. If they do, you won't have no chance at all. I don't mind gun buzzards piling on me, once they rear up on their hind legs and start," mumbled Sheldon, turning and reluctantly following Rip. "When I have to fight, then I plumb love to smell the smoke." Rip half dragged him on. Riley led the way. They wound through shacks and past ragged tents, and came to the back door of the old livery stable. Things were in an uproar behind them by this time. Riley halted them there in the shadows, and they stood for a few moments to listen to the noisy voices that had leapt into sound behind Mags. Now the wolf pack's howling for real blood, whispered Riley. The ducks what come into Mags are about the toughest in Killer Virgil's gaunt string. One of them was Wyatt Gold. The shortest one was Yellow York, and the other one was Red River Sam, no other name for him being known since he hit Badwater right after they struck oil. I saw them plotting out front. They fooled me, as they aimed to do. I'm sure of that now. And when do we meet the rest of the said howling pack? Demanded Sheldon, still full of fight. I ain't a bit gun-shy, Slick, and the sooner the music's played, the better I'm going to like waltzing to the band. You keep your shirt tail down and don't sprout so many wings, ordered Riley. I know this town better than any damned hatchet spur Sheldon could ever know it. It's the murderingest hole in the face of the Rockies. Best thing now is to sort of get in the clear and stay there for a spell to see what happens. Come on. You said you had a boar's nest upstairs in this dump. Better get in it and talk low with the light out. They moved on with that. Before they had gone a dozen paces in the dark old hallway they heard the distant drum of another Colt going off with 3 quick explosions somewhere down the street. A fight in the Red Cat, and you can bet on it, whispered Riley. If they don't kill somebody in the dump one Saturday night, then they kill 2 or 3 the next one. They came to the dirty stairs and mounted them as noiselessly as they could. Not until they were in their room with the door closed did Riley speak again. And now he turned on them in the darkness. If it ain't yet function-wise through your minds, you fellas might get it in your heads that you ain't wanted in Badland without a hangman's halter sort of dangling over you to keep you in line and we're wanted. I tried to tell Bull that you two wouldn't be, but you can't tell a hatchet spur Sheldon nothing. You're gonna keep barking, growled Sheldon, until you breed a knot on your head and a couple of black eyes. What we want to know, if you'll stop talking like a buzzard gagging, is what the fight was about, why we was shot at, and who it was that we killed back of that eating joint. If I know any of the signs, continued the cowboy, ignoring Sheldon, it was a hung-up job on you, and you're not apt to be bothered again for a little while. The birds that jumped you and your horse and buggy expert was a couple of no-good whiskey-lapping gun scrappers tuned up for the job with Wyatt York, Yellow, and Red River Sam knowing you two would either kill them or they'd kill you. In either case, it's good medicine, for Killer Virgil to have a killing to charge aging any tough-looking jaspers what drift into Badland. He'll probably be seeing you, and maybe you'll talk turkey buzzard his way, or, damn it, Virgil have you hung to a fresh cottonwood limb down on the poison. Virgil knows how to put men under his thumb, and he's put the halter right up you both, if you can catch the point. And if the other pair had shot us, answered Rip calmly, they would have been under the thumb and the halter, yes? Exactly. Grinned the cowboy in the darkness. You've leastwise got horse sense, but I'm unable yet to see why a spry-looking fella like you would be trailing with Bull Sheldon. What I want to know, there was still a growl in Sheldon's voice, is how a skunk like Wright got to be sheriff of this town. "'Cause it's a tough town," answered Riley, "and the last sheriff, an old fella named Ben Horan, who had it until after the oil boom, wasn't tough enough to handle it, though he'd been here for years. He hired Wright as his deputy, and next thing you know somebody killed off Ben Horan, shot him in the back. And that made Wright sheriff," exclaimed Rip. "Good work. You guess quick what a lot of folks have said," nodded Riley. "Ain't it a pity the hatchet spur Sheldons ain't bright? They're bright enough, if and when they have somebody to talk to." The hint of a grin crossed Sheldon's face. "I'm way ahead of you both, but I'm saying if Wright pulled the backhanded trick on us that you say he did tonight, then it was a hell of a thing. It was the best trick in the world." Rip had walked onto the window and was looking down on the street. With the right sheriff behind it, and the right men in his net, he would have the cow by the tail and a downhill drag to anything he wanted to do. "Yeah, I see it all clear now," nodded Sheldon grimly. "If we're called upon to do something, we do it or get hung. That's a fact, even if you did fall aging it by accident," agreed Riley. "And hanging a hatchet spur Sheldon would be about the only respectable thing I do reckon Killer Virgil could ever do." They waited in the room for more than an hour with the lamp still unlighted before they decided to venture down on the street again. Rip had stood there, watching the crowds. He had seen Killer Virgil Wright twice with tough gunmen at his heels. Once something told Rip that the sheriff was glancing up at the window as he passed. "You're sort of expected to venture down, I reckon," whispered Slick Riley as the sheriff and his band came down the street again. "If all the signs are right, nary word's going to be said to you or about you in the open for maybe 24 hours. Maybe not until Monday. There'll be a lot of talk, everybody wondering who done the shooting and Wright keeping it quiet and building up the case until you'll think you shot a couple of kings instead of only a pair of gun buzzards. Just don't try to leave town. If you do, Virgil cut your trail out from under you." "Meaning," nodded Rip, "that we're actually under arrest right now even if we've not been locked up." "Exactly," Riley slapped him on the back. You can see the light. A band playing up the street was calling to Sheldon. Rip could see that, and they left the room, walking quietly down the stairs and to the front door to halt there for a few minutes in the shadows. In a little while they separated. Rip and Sheldon always did that when they were on the lookout for trouble. Rip allowed Sheldon to cross the street, and then turned and sauntered up the street. Riley, seemingly now attached to them and ready to stick it out, come what would, was left to straggle along behind. In this fashion they were like scouts in danger. To have gone up the street together would have invited slaughter in a group, but by keeping well apart they could watch each other and, if jumped for a fight, they would make it a three-sided affair. But nothing happened. Badland had become quiet except for the milling mobs in the drinking dives and a straggly crowd gathering around the carnival tents up the street. Sheldon headed for the snake pit. It was exactly what Rip knew he would do, and there in the shadow behind the sputtering kerosene torches he halted, for the time at least the snake pit's only customer. Rip stopped in front of the Indian medicine show, the magic elixir of life, and saw Chief Hair of the Dog standing with his arms folded haughtily across his bosom, an enormous war bonnet with feathers blowing in the wind, and a blanket the color of sundown plucked around him. In front of him, baying his lungs out and wearing a silk hat, a huge cravat, and dressed as a circus ringmaster with paste jewels flashing like a locomotive's headlight, stood an enormous man who called himself nature's great physician, the boon to mankind, the big-hearted savior of life. If the patient had the $2 for a nauseous brew reported to do anything from curing a horse with the bots to growing hair on a billiard ball. Rip glanced slowly around and saw Slick Riley. That worthy had evidently forgotten that there might be danger here. He was standing in front of the Hoochie Coochie dancer's tent, a long-necked scarecrow with his eyes fixed on a curvaceous girl in a brief pair of red tights. It was the usual, old-fashioned street carnival. Half the people in Badland had probably seen everything in every tent a dozen times, and yet it was the one place to go outside of a saloon, a dance hall or a gambling dive where a man's hard-earned money parted company with him like frightened birds on the wing. Rip stole a glance back at the snake pit and saw that Sheldon was buying peanuts and popcorn for the massive pansy. No one would have suspected that that hard-headed old gunman had been in a fight less than 2 hours ago. He was as happy as a pet coon with a red stick of candy and a mate to play with in the spring, but he was sober, and he was not at all asleep to possible danger over there. And now Killer Virgil Wright came sauntering into the picture. He had that same important mien, and something told Rip that he had been back out there in the darkness somewhere watching him and Sheldon. To Rip's surprise, he saw the man smile when he looked at him, and then he was gone, disappearing inside one of the largest, most pretentious of all of the tents. It could not have been more than 10 minutes later before a yell of excitement went up. A dead man had been found behind the Hoochie Coochie dancer's tent, a man lying face downward on the ground with his throat cut from ear to ear and 2 hard-lipped knife wounds driven through his heart from behind. Chapter 9. The band stopped playing. For 10 minutes the speakers in front of their tents ceased their sing-song hawking of the wonders of the world. Rip was standing now leaning against a tall stack of the carnival's iron-bound shipping cases, a good place for a man to keep his back protected from a bullet from behind regardless of what Slick Riley had said about them not being bothered. Riley had disappeared, drawn into the Hoochie Coochie dancer's tent like a moth to the flame, but the tale of the murder was not long in finding its way even into the dancer's tent, and soon men were pouring out of it. Riley was one of the last to come, and with him came 2 strapping men in boots and chaps, and each with a pair of 6-shooters at his hips. In the shadows Rip did not recognize them instantly, but as they came into the light he saw that the man on Riley's right was Wyatt Gold, and the one on the cowboy's left was Red River Sam. Each of the burly men now wore a small star on his vest, and suddenly Rip was staring at handcuffs shining on Slick Riley's wrists. "What'll we do?" Sheldon was sidling up to Rip's left now, forgetting his snake charmer. "They've got Slick for that killing. Do we gun dust them and take him away from them?" "We don't." Rip spoke from the side of his mouth. "We still play soft and low tunes and wait." "It looks like letting a friend down," frowned Sheldon, fondling the butt of one of his guns. "Hurts me to do that, bad as I used to hate the Rileys back in Missouri. Slick's tried to be nice to us since we hit this murdering hole." "Do as I tell you," ordered Rip. "Stand still and say nothing until I give you the word." Men passed them carrying the dead man on a stretcher a few minutes later. Rip got a glimpse of the blood-smeared face. He saw that it was the face of a young man, dressed in blue serge and shiny black shoes. He had been wearing what Sheldon would have described as a boiled shirt, which had once been white but which was now almost covered with blood. "Looks like a mere boy," grunted Sheldon as the men passed on. "They butcher them young or old in Badland." "Keep your opinions to yourself," Rip warned. "Remember, we're both sitting on a powder keg with the fuse already sputtering." But "But I tell you they've arrested Slick for the killing," exclaimed Sheldon a few minutes later. "You know Slick couldn't have done it. Hell, he was all ears and eyes in the tent. They needed a goat." Rip kept his voice lowered. "Slick's the Billy with the whiskers. Keep your mouth shut about it. A day or two in jail won't hurt him." "Something tells me," scowled Sheldon, "that is losing his guts since he landed in Badland. It ain't a bit like you. You ain't the kind to set back on a job." Rip did not answer him. It was job enough to keep Sheldon quiet, a thing that would have been utterly impossible had he not been sober. The best way to stop Sheldon's tongue was to ignore it. They stood there watching and listening to the talk of the crowds milling in front of them until a half-breed Crow Indian youth eased up beside them and just to Rip's right. Rip ignored the boy until he heard him speak in a low, broken tone. "Me got paper for white man who fire train." A note was slipped into his hand then. It had been folded and refolded until it was no more than 2 inches long and an inch wide. The youth was quick enough about it, and then he was sidling away, an unconcerned figure melting back into the crowds. "Let's get out of here for a spell." Rip pinched Sheldon's arm. "Go first. I'll cover. I ought to tell Pansy." "Never mind your friend, Jonah." Rip pinched his arm. "I've got something I've been waiting for." Sheldon looked at him with a frown, and moved off reluctantly. Rip followed him. They returned to their room and Rip now covered the split and torn old window shade, using a blanket front one of the bunks. He struck a match, and was turning toward the battered brass lamp on the rickety table in the corner when he heard Sheldon grunt. He turned and saw his partner pitch forward on his face. Then the whole world seemed to fall atop of Rip from overhead as the powerful form of a man dropped atop of him. Chapter 10. The fight had come without warning. 2 men, powerful as gorillas, had slipped into the old stables through the rear doors and made their way to the loft above the room. A trapdoor in the grimy ceiling had been lifted. In the darkness of the room no one would have noticed the opening, and now the battle was on. Rip was dazed by the blow of that lunging figure striking him with his feet on the head and shoulders. He went all the way to the floor, a helpless, sprawling shape with the breath knocked out of him. He wheeled over as a hairy-backed fist smacked down against the nape of his neck, and in the struggle he heard Sheldon snorting and cursing with the second man atop of him and pounding him with a furious rain of wild blows. It looked hopeless for a moment. No words had yet been spoken. The room seemed full of snarls, the sounds of battering fists, a grunt now and then coming from Sheldon, and finally a sputtered oath as booted and spurred feet scraped harshly on the rough floor. Rip managed to get to his knees. The blow of a fist smashed like an explosion against the side of his head. An oath followed, ripping through bearded lips to tell Rip his man had either broken a bone in his hand or had injured it severely. Then Rip got in a blow. It was a wild swing, a desperate haymaker of the worst kind, but it landed flat against a bearded jaw, and Rip felt the man fighting him suddenly sway back. It was an opportunity not to be ignored. This was a fight, a rough and tumble, knock down and drag out, kick or claw, gouge or bite scrap. Rip struck again. This time his fist smashed straight into a snarling face, and then he was on his feet, kicking and clawing, ripping and slashing. It was like 2 struggling animals now. Rip was outweighed by all of 30 pounds, but he was giving his unknown assailant blow for blow now. They went backward against the door, which cracked, threatening to give away and splinter into kindling wood. Rip's man was fighting him like a wild cat in action. Twice Rip warded off brutal upward drives from the man's knee, and they rocked on back across the room, smashing into the 2 rickety chairs and turning them to wreckage. The blanket over the window came down a few moments later as the 2 fighters raked against it. Now there was a little light in the room, and Rip was able to drive his blows straighter to their marks. He knocked his man off his feet, and then saw a flash of light on the barrel of a gun just in time to send forward a vicious kick that knocked the weapon out of the downed man's hand. A moment later Rip was astride and atop of him. He drove 3 swift blows straight to the man's jaw. Then the door came down with a crash. Rip had just time enough to glance up and see the door fly into wreckage. There was a dim form flying through the cloud of splinters, and then the sound of a fleeing man striking the old stairs and going down them with another man following right behind him. "You've got me." The voice was like the nervous bleat of a panic-stricken sheep as Rip drove in another blow. "You don't need to kill me, fella." "Sure, I've got you." Rip drove another blow straight to the man's jaw, and the man seemed to wilt into the floor. Rip slammed him again, and then staggered up and back against the wall just as heavy feet sounded on the stairs and Bull Sheldon stumbled into the room with the bulky form of the second man on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" That was Sheldon's first question as he hurled his man on the floor. "If you are, strike a match and let's look our birds over." "Right as I can be," Rip assured him as he struck a match. "What have we got for supper?" "Something the cats drug in," growled Sheldon as the light of a match flared and Rip picked up the old lamp from the floor. "One looks like his daddy and mammy might have belonged to the elephant breed, and the other one looks like the buzzards might have hatched him." In the light Sheldon himself looked like something else impossible to describe. There were lumps on his face and a cut drooling blood from a small gash over either eye. The top was torn out of his derby, the brim broken, and the left lapel of his coat ripped. But it was not Sheldon that interested Rip now. He stepped forward after lighting the lamp and proceeded to look over the two unconscious bundles of humanity hurled into a messy pile on the floor. One glance at the man Sheldon had battered into unconsciousness was enough to tell that he was Yellow York, though he did not look much like Yellow York now. He looked as if he had been mauled and clawed by a threshing machine. His face was as battered as Sheldon's derby. "He tried to hit me with one of his guns," explained Sheldon. "I got my hands on it and wore hell out of him with it. Here, I'll roll him off your playmate and see what that little boy blue looks like." Sheldon's right hand shot down and caught York by the back of the coat collar. He lifted the man as if he had been nothing more than a bag of grain and hurled him against the wall. "Frisk him for his fighting tools," ordered Rip, "and throw them out the window." "Done frisked him when I caught him down in the hall," grinned Sheldon. "How's your feller?" Rip had already stepped forward and bent over the man. He was a whale of a beast, a hair-lipped giant with red hair. Early in the afternoon Rip had noticed him down the street in a drinking dive called the Little Volcano, but he scarcely looked like the same man now. His face was battered, his nose broken, the lower lip split as if the hair lip ran nearly to the point of his chin. "Ain't a bit pretty, is he?" grinned Sheldon. "What'll we do, throw them out the window or skin them?" "Watch them for a minute." Rip moved back closer to the light. Keeping his back to the men, he took the note out of his pocket that the half-breed Indian had given him. He unfolded it carefully, perused the huge, ungainly scrawl of handwriting. "Get your horses and ride to the big white ranch house on the high bench 3 miles straight north of town." "What is it?" whispered Sheldon, easing up behind but still keeping his eyes on the two men on the floor. "Wings to fly with," Rip whispered back. "Grab up what little truck we have here, and go down and saddle the horses. We're shoving." "But what about these ducks?" "Leave them lying where they are," ordered Rip. "I'll make sure they stay here until you're ready. When they do come to their senses, they should be able to find their way back to the man who sent them here." Chapter 11. With both eyes open, believe it or not, Sheldon grinned when Rip came down to the stables carrying their saddle pockets. "I'm surely beginning to like this here man's town. I'd like to go by and see Pansy, if we're riding far and lonesome-wise again." "No time for that," Rip said, looking at him in the starlight. "And if she did see you now in your fancy garb and that face, she'd laugh you out of town." "Women come, and women go," intoned Sheldon, swinging as lightly as a boy of 16 into his saddle, "but I've warned my sweet Pansy May. Any old time she hears I've gone, she can look for a letter writ as long as my arm and sent to my sugar baby by the overland mail. Ain't she?" "Shut up," growled Rip. "Keep your mind on your business. We may have somebody watching us." He turned his horse toward the great cliffs in the distance to eastward. They swung abruptly away from each other, each now a hawk in the darkness. At any instant Rip expected to hear the report of a gun, but they were soon leaving everything behind them. A mile out of town and Rip changed the course to northward. It looked safe enough after that with Badland hidden beyond a low, lizard-like ridge. Sheldon swung into Rip's left to ride stirrup to stirrup with him as they cantered along at an easy pace in the starlight. "I'll never be a town dude," mumbled Sheldon after a long silence. "Told Pansy May that. Just sniff this good old clear air out here. Nothing beats it, and Badland's right there with its town smell behind us. Wonder if Pansy May could stand riding the trails with me and sleeping under the shining stars?" "She might," grinned Rip, "if you could find something big enough to haul her in. But look here." He swung to one side in his saddle. "Get bulk and dyed hair out of your mind for a little while. I've got some things to tell you." "I suspect you would have," nodded Sheldon. "Fire away and let's hear the long tale of what's been griping you. And when you're through, maybe I'll tell you some things, one of them being that I still ain't liking the thought of Slick lying back there in that jailhouse. He's in perfectly good company." Rip glanced up at the stars. "He'll find 2 United States deputy marshals up there, and a postal inspector to boot. And I'm riding with another United States deputy marshal." "Yeah," grinned Sheldon. "Fella named Rip, I do believe. And when did you catch on?" demanded Rip. "I didn't," admitted Sheldon. "Just been putting 2 and 2 together and making 4 out of it tonight. First, as I've told you, we was near Broken Gun Creek, then I saw you talking to a couple of Jaspers and going in a spell of huddles with them, thinking I was too drunk to catch on. One of the Jaspers left Gun Creek on a train ahead of us. We left on the next up country. Today I saw the Jasper who come ahead of us. My pansy mate told me what he was, and I suspect he's the duck you got your note from tonight. I didn't ask too many questions. For some reason I trust you. Maybe it's because of my sweet and gentle disposition. But see here, he pointed his finger at Rip like a pistol, this is one time I ain't leaving a town complete and waltzing off with my true love left behind. Now go on with what you was about to say before my startling brightness tied your tongue. Knowing as much as you do, you'll come through like a buck in a race. Rip told him that a few minutes later as they were mounting a long hill. Go on and play the fool, just as you always do. I guess you get fun out of it, and it throws everybody off guard. Lights were glowing ahead of them already. They seemed unusually bright, and they came out of a grove of trees and from a rambling two-story house that looked like some rich Spanish dong's hacienda. Beyond the house were corrals, stables, and sheds, and in front of the western porch of the house they could see a line of saddled horses standing at the hitch rack. "Looks like a rich man's dump," exclaimed Sheldon. "I swear it does." "It should be," agreed Rip. "It belongs to William Luft, and Luft owns about everything around here that the Ghost Gang haven't run off with since they've been operating." "Well, give me a little time as we ride up," grinned Sheldon. "I'd like to first find the horse trough and wash my face and spruce myself a mite. You can never tell when good-looking men and good-looking women meet." And to the horse trough traveled Sheldon when they rode up and dropped reins at the hitch rack among a dozen horses standing there. Rip was forced to wait impatiently until Sheldon returned, and then they walked onto the porch, across it, and rapped on the broad front door. "Come in." Somebody inside the huge house bellowed that. Rip turned the bolt and the great door swung open. With Sheldon at his heels and his battered derby in his hand, Rip stepped into an immense room with an amazingly high ceiling where the dazzling lights blinded him. He shook his head and rubbed his hands over his eyes. A wide-mouthed fireplace seemed to develop into shape at his right with a rack of antique firearms above it. He saw old-fashioned paintings on the wall, a thick rug on the floor, and huge, overstuffed furniture at every hand. It was indeed the living room of a rich man's castle. "Come right on into the other room, gentlemen." The voice called out again. "We're expecting you." Rip frowned and started on, still a little blinded by the glaring lights. They were in the center of the great room when they were jerked to a halt by a mocking laugh that seemed to tumble down to them from the ceiling. "And now put up your hands," rasped a voice. "You gents are welcome to our city, and your sneak out of Badland was just dandy. Nobody'll know where you've gone or why until that shooting you done behind the restaurant is told to the town. Then folks will naturally think your feet got cold and you streaked for tall timber." And now Rip saw the speaker. He stood on a long, beautifully draped balcony at the end of the room opposite the fireplace. He was a tall, bony-faced individual of middle age dressed in a gray range garb. A sawed-off shotgun was in his hands, the muzzle covering Rip and Sheldon. Then, as if everything had to take its own time to develop in the bright light, Rip saw two men at either side of the man. Shotguns filled their hands, and leering grins were on their faces. "You dudes are good," chuckled the man who had spoken. "You walk right in on the baited trap with both eyes open." Chapter 12. Trapped and, ain't this one a beauty? Somebody said that about Sheldon as he and Rip were being relieved of their weapons in a circle of guns covering them. "Hard hat and a red necktie, what makes him look like his throat was cut from ear to ear. I'll bet he knocks the women dead." "He does," agreed another man. "He's been sparking up great ever since he hit Badland." "To a horse." "I'll bet," chuckled a third man. "To something bigger than a horse," laughed the second. "He's been going after the red-headed snake charmer, not knowing she's as bald-headed as fish's nose and all that red hair comes off in a wig. All of which is a lie, and I can whip any two men what just said it," snarled Sheldon. "Without a gun muzzle in my back and another one in my belly, neither of you dudes would dare open your mouth about her." Laughter drowned out half of what he said. Then, robbed of their weapons and even to their watches, their heavy jackknives and the last penny of money in their pockets, Rip and Sheldon were marched on through the room into a long hallway. The whole house seemed to be teeming with gunmen by this time. There was a swagger and a reckless dash about every one of them, though some wore black masks made from huge handkerchiefs that completely covered their heads and faces, leaving mere slits in the cloth through which they could see. "To your right now, fella." The leader gouged Rip in the middle of the back with the muzzle of one of his guns. "Straight onto that door you see ahead. You ain't going to be without company. We treat our guests like ladies and gents." Rip walked on, grim-faced, the blue eyes now sheening with a dangerous green, his lips tightly compressed. This was no time for a man to balk at anything he was told to do, and once he snapped out a command at the snarling Sheldon. "Shut your mouth, bull," he ordered. "Only fools rant when they're helpless. You got sense, partner?" chuckled the leader. "We was told you would have." A door with a guard in front of it was now opened. Beyond it was a long, dimly lighted room that looked like a country store. There were tall shelves at every hand and no sign of another door or a single window in the thick walls of hand-hewn logs. "Welcome to the grub storeroom of the old walking bar after ranch," laughed the leader, giving Rip a quick hard shove and sending him stumbling into the room. "Throw the fine gent in behind him, boys, and give Miss Luft and her mammy a thrill." Sheldon came then, the torn top of his derby a flapping lid, and the door was slammed closed and bolted as Rip stood there staring at the faces of the prisoners in the room. Bill Cassidy, one of the United States deputy marshals Rip had met in Gun Creek Junction, was there, a huge, square-jawed, square-faced man, sitting flat on the floor with his bootless feet wrapped in wet rags. Just beyond him was William Luft, white-faced and scowling. Beyond Luft sat a slender, yet beautiful woman of somewhere close to 50, and beyond the woman was Beth Luft, who was looking at Rip with a tired smile on her face. "Greetings." Sheldon was the first to remove his ruined derby and speak. "I like the company, and it looks like we've got plenty of victuals." He glanced at the well-stocked shelves, "but our quarters seem sort of crowded." "Have a seat on the floor," said Bill Bradbury wryly. "And before you ask any questions." His face sobered as he looked up at Rip. "I'll admit writing you that note. My feet are covered with blisters. They put the fire cure to me." "But what's it all about?" demanded Rip. "It looks like we've been jailed." "Good and properly jailed, yes," nodded Bradbury. "We've been spending much time and good government money looking for the Ghost Gang, and the Ghost Gang has spent no money and very little time in finding us. That was part of the noted gang of gentlemen who ushered you and the lady killer in. And one of them is a man I'll kill before I'm done," growled Sheldon, looking at his battered derby. "He said some unkind things about a lady friend of mine." The door opened again. To Rip's surprise, Dr. Hargrove, face white and eyes staring, was shoved ruthlessly into the room. He stumbled against Sheldon, half knocked him down, rocked against the wall, and fell. "More company for you folks," sneered the skeleton-faced gunman. "And more are apt to be coming." "What a tragedy," moaned Dr. Hargrove, sitting up and looking around him. "A terrible tragedy. They took me out of my tent, spitted like a common cur on the muzzle of a revolver." "They were probably very easy on you when you look at Mr. Bradbury," pointed out William Luft. "Both his feet are badly burned. Sit down and make yourself as comfortable as you can, Doctor. Needless to say, we are all sorry to find you in the same helpless plight as ourselves." But the meaning of it," cried Hargrove. "My heavens, ladies and gentlemen, they have not told me a thing. Not a blessed thing. I was talking with Sheriff Wright only a few minutes before the two beastly armed scoundrels walked in on me. A grating, grunting, and shuffling noise beyond the door halted him. It was like speaking of the devil and seeing him appear. The door was again hauled open. A weaving, bloody-faced ghost stood there, Killer Virgil Wright. The man was reeling on his feet, his eyes glassy. His mouth was a broken lump of blue-black flesh, the lips already swollen 3 times their normal size and many of his teeth missing. Somebody had struck him down across the side of the face, and his cheek was cut to the bone. "All right, don't stand and gape." A voice rasped that behind Wright, and he was given a quick shove. A man robbed of his guns and all his power, Wright came pitching on into the room like a corpse. Rip caught him just in time to keep him from falling flat on his face. Chapter 13. Rip was too amazed to speak. From the beginning he had suspected Killer Virgil Wright of being somehow connected with the Ghost Gang. His plight now indicated anything else but that. Killer Virgil's face looked like that of a man who had been caught somewhere in a dynamite explosion. Blood oozed from his hands, showing that he had tried to put up a fight, and more blood oozed from a cut in the back of his head where a heavy Colt had slapped him down. He was groaning as if in intense pain. "And still we don't know just what the play is to be," grumbled Bill Bradbury as Beth Luft rose and poured more cold water on the bandages on his feet. "I don't suppose we'll have to wait long to find out, but the thing that gets me is how the Ghost Gang got here so quickly from Blacksmith Pass." "An easy question to answer, my friend." The door had swung open again. Standing there was a huge figure completely covered from head to foot in black. With a cowl covering the newcomer looked almost like a monk. Behind him stood men with 6-shooters covering everybody in the room. "The Ghost Gang is larger than anyone has suspected," the black figure in the doorway was going on. "Only 8 of our crew took part in the last stab at Luft's stinky up-country train. Thanks to that man." The cowled head jerked in a nod to Rip. "One of the boys was killed. That man is naturally out of the picture, but the remaining 7 are already making their way to Badland for the final dirge to be played to the town." He paused as if to allow the full effect of his words to sink home with his listeners. His voice had been almost like a sad drone, its tone muffled by the black hood. "Killer Virgil has served us well." Rip could imagine a smile behind that hood now. The finger of suspicion has pointed to him many times. We played it like that. We also played it for the finger to point to others. Only one man really started to find out something. Strange as it may seem, Luft, he was your young timekeeper who was killed tonight with a knife on the carnival lot. We killed him right under Wright's nose, and then made Wright foolish enough to have another man arrested for it. Wright has proven most handy in arresting anybody we wanted jailed and put out of the way. He was handy, also, at hanging the noose over man by getting them into gunfights with his flock of rowdies. Even now Wright doesn't know who I am or where I came from, but I know Wright, know that he is wanted in Arizona for murder, and I've used that in my roundabout manner to make him waltz several times. I could go on for hours, ladies and gentlemen, the hooded head bowed, but it isn't necessary, even if I add that we might have gone on playing Badland for, well, in plain English, a sucker. Too many government agents started slipping in. In the past I've learned that it was wiser to slip out than to stand, and I might add that it has paid splendidly. But to the point. The masked man cleared his throat. "Luft, you still love cattle and horse ranching, and you thought you had 10 loyal men riding for you. You think they're still about? Well, only 4 were loyal, and they're safely housed in the basement of your fine barn, along with old Wang, your ancient but honorable Chinese cook. The others, they belong to me, my friend. You have all seen me," he continued. "None of you know me, but you and all these people are here because I ordered it no more than 2 hours ago. One of Killer Virgil's crack deputies, a man also in my service, is in charge of the jail in Badland, and the report is out that Killer Virgil had slipped away to try to bring back the cruises from their high-range lands, a noble inspiration, if Killer Virgil or anybody else had the nerve to try it. I owe a debt of gratitude to the cruises, also. They, too, have served us well for taking suspicion on their shoulders. And now for what might be called the dirt." He turned toward Luft. "Luft, your payroll came through because of your daughter, this man there," he nodded to Rip, "and his friend. The money went into the vault of your one-horse Badland State Bank. We know that, and we know also that it is impossible to crack your vault without blowing Badland into the poison. The time lock will not open until Monday, and Wright's gunman guards are supposed to be on hand with their shotguns to guard the payoff. Every guard, Luft, is now in my pay, but you have the combination to the vault. And I am beginning to see the point." Luft spoke up. "You expect me to give you that combination so that you can yet get the payroll?" The man in black laughed softly. "You are a man with foresight. You will give us that combination. We will be on hand to open the vault. That will be very simple. Unfortunately, you might say, that is not the entire end of what we want. We want an order drawn on the Stock National of Gun Creek Junction for another sum of $120,379. The odd change is to keep down suspicion. And you expect me to do that?" Luft stumbled to his feet, his face white with both alarm and anger. "Why, you. Don't say it." Cut in the man in black. "Remember, there are ladies present. I would suggest that you sit down like a gentleman. What we want we will have. That is all I have to tell you at the moment. Wait." He lifted his hand. "You do not want us to take you in hand, not just yet. I fear we will have to do it before we are through. But you would never carry out a scheme like this," Luft said desperately. "My stars, man, you couldn't get away with it. Something would happen. There's the long trip to Gun Creek Junction, and—" "Quiet, please." The man in black held up his hand. "We are masters of the situation. We will take an engine and a coach, and the run will be made in record time. With us will go all the money, save what we have necessarily spent, of our former raids. We even know the code you use when wiring the bank for money, so the bank will be ready. One of our men, a telegraph operator, is in charge of your Badland depot. I have allowed no little detail to escape me, Luft. As you go along you will find me very thorough." But, Dr. Hargrove broke in. "What part do I play in this dastardly scheme, sir?" Doctor again Rip could picture a smile behind the face of the Black Hood. "You will play a very important part. You are an imposing gentleman. You will go to Gun Creek Junction with us." I won't do it," cried the doctor. "Even if I did I would expose you to the law the moment I set foot in town. I would scream out your frightful plan to everybody in Badland before you could get me to the train." "That, too, has been thought of," nodded the man in black. "We have desperate means for desperate things. You have a daughter on her way out here from Chicago to join you in Badland. She arrived in Gun Creek Junction Friday morning before Mr. Luft's little train pulled out for Badland. There was a 2-hour wait between trains. 3 of my men took her in charge. I have a letter here from your daughter. You will do as we say or that daughter will die. You can't do this. William Luft roared. I, kill me if you want, but... In due time, yes, nodded the man in black. But, first, you will do exactly what I say. Luft, I always get what I demand. Miss Luft, will you kindly step out here for a few minutes? I will not, cried the girl, her voice violent with desperation. I will die beside my father. Oh! Tee thunder of a shot cut her off. A heavy black colt had snaked forward from a slit in the robes of the man in black. A tearing gash of flame shot a yard-long ribbon of fire into the room. A cry came from Mrs. Luft as a small shower of dust and splinters puffed from the hard old logs barely 3 inches above her head. Wait now. The voice of the man in the doorway had become iron hard. I could have driven that bullet through your mother's eyes as easily as into the logs. Will you step out now, Miss Luft? The girl arose. Rip had never seen such a look in a human face. Beth Luft was like a girl under the hypnotic eyes of a magician. Her eyes stared. Her face was like chalk. She moved forward slowly, her hands lifted. She was like someone walking in her sleep. Thank you, said the man in black, bowing politely as she stepped through the doorway. In a few minutes you will be allowed to return. I assure you, and all the rest of you. Rip got a glimpse of fierce black eyes leering through the holes in the hood. Miss Luft will be unharmed. But when she returns she will have a story to tell which will teach you that a terrorist holds you in his hands. I can spare your lives or I can take them. Here, Dr. Hargrove, is a letter that will interest you. His left hand flipped it forward and it fell on the floor. Look it over while I talk to Miss Luft. And now he bowed again. I thank you. He stepped back. The door started to close gently. Rip got one more glimpse of the girl. She was going on down the hall, still walking as if she were in a trance. Then the door was closed, heavy bars slid in place, and heavy silence fell over the old storeroom. The devil had stepped up from hell, delivered an ultimatum, and was gone, taking a beautiful girl with him. Chapter 14. Rip picked up the letter from the floor. He glanced at the handwriting. It was small, neat, and firm, and unmistakably feminine. He stepped back to Dr. Hargrove, and the doctor snatched for the letter eagerly. Dr. Hargrove was white-faced when he finished reading the letter. Tears were wrung from his eyes and rolled down his cheeks. Sobs shook him. For a long time he sat groaning, rocking from side to side. My Laura, he sobbed. My poor, darling little Laura. Ill for months in a Chicago hospital, a serious operation, and the poor child on her way out here to join me. I can't bear it. I'll go mad. Mad, I tell you. He lunged to his feet, clutching the letter to his bosom. My God. Sit down, doctor. Rip took his arm. This is a time to think calmly and try to pull yourself together. We're all here in the same predicament. The same predicament. Hargrove whirled upon him like a maniac. We are not being held in a sheepherder's cabin on the side of a lonely mountain. We are men. And this poor woman here, he pointed wildly to Mrs. Luft, and her daughter at least have what little protection we may be able to give them from these terrible ruffians, but my Laura, my poor little Laura. Why, terrible things may already happen to her. We must do something, gentlemen. Dr. Hargrove, Rip was looking at him steadily, calculatingly. When we're in a jam like this we don't do anything. We simply wait, and we take orders as they're given to us. We don't butt our heads against the wall. The best thing for you to do is to sit down. But look at this letter. With a shaking hand, Hargrove thrust the letter under Rip's nose. His letter went the round of the room. Rip and Bradbury read it, and Rip studied it a long time. It was the pathetic message of a helpless girl being held a prisoner, a plea for life if Rip had ever seen one. As soon as Rip had finished with it, Hargrove snatched it back. He started to read it a second time, and he started to moan again. Rip stopped his reading and his moaning by making him put the letter in his pocket. William Luft and his wife did not seem to be interested in the letter. They were walking the floor and watching the door. Now and then Rip saw Mrs. Luft wring her hands. Luft put his arm around her, halting her nervous pacing as he spoke to her in a low voice. Keep cool, Julia, keep cool. He patted her shoulder. We'll come out of this. Something tells me we will, honey. But Beth. The woman was fighting to keep from weeping. We don't know what's happening to her. I think you can trust the hooded monk to keep his word, madam, Rip put in calmly. At least, you can trust him as far as he has promised. Yes, I am sure you can, Julia, agreed Luft, but there was a note of doubt in his tone. Through Beth, they're driving at me. The door opened a few minutes after that. Beth Luft walked in. Her mother and father rushed to her and threw their arms around her. The hooded man in black was there behind her with men at either side of him covering the room with guns. Before the man spoke, Rip again got a glimpse at the man's fierce eyes, and they reminded him of the shining black heads of snakes lurking in their holes. "Miss Luft," intoned the man, "has seen something. Perhaps it is something she will never forget." "Dad, you will do what they say." The girl broke in, her voice almost a high-pitched scream. "You might have known who were loyal to us among the riders, Jack Jones, Tucker, Murdoch, and Charlie. Old Wang is there with them, too, just as that monster behind me said." I saw them, Dad." Her voice was suddenly jerking with sobs. "I saw them all. Dad, it's terrible. They're in their barn, and they're all hanging on wires fastened to beams. They're hanging there on wires wrapped around each of their great toes." "You devil!" Luft whirled, his face that of a man suddenly insane with rage. "You bloodthirsty brute. I'll." "Don't act like a fool, Luft," the man in the doorway said in a calm voice, his right hand slipping through a slit in his robe, the long black Colt appearing. "First I'll take the combination of the vault. A man behind me has his pencil ready." Luft stood there, his big hands opening and closing. Rip had never seen a man so pale. Muscles stood out in his forehead and neck like huge welts on hairless rawhide. Rip set himself to catch him, for Luft looked as if he was going to leap forward like a springing cat. "Your men hang there, Luft," the man in black was going on in his calm tone, "until I get the combination, and then they will be let down immediately. You may begin when you're ready." And then Luft slumped. Rip stepped to him, catching him by the arm. It looked as if Luft was going to sink into a dead faint on the floor. Rip held him up while Sheldon kicked forward an old keg. Luft sat down, elbows on his knees, violently quivering hands cupped to his chin. His voice came, deep but far away and racked with terrible strain. "It's a simple combination. Several turns to the right. I usually spin the tumbler. Stop on 88. 4 turns to the left. Stop on 74. 3 to the right. Stop on 49. 2 to left. 28. Right until it clicks. Turn the handle." "Thank you," said the man in black. "Your riders and your cook will be snipped down immediately. Go do it. Number 9. He spoke to a man behind him. "I pride myself on keeping my word to the letter." The man he had spoken to had hardly disappeared when a gun thundered the room full of noise. There was no warning. The man in black did not appear to move an eyelash. A roaring blaze simply darted from the slit in his robe, and a terrified scream of agony came on the heels of the shot, with the quick odor of blood rising in the acrid bite of the sudden cloud of gun smoke. Chapter 15. Wright had been shot. It was the most brutal thing any man could have seen. Wright had been sitting there without saying a word to anyone, a man cowed, beaten, and broken, robbed of all his show and dash and made a quivering weakling in front of the others. Now he was writhing on the floor with hands clutched to the lower part of his stomach and the blood fluttering through his fingers. "A surprise, my kind bully, for those who have lived all their lives by surprising others," intoned the hooded devil in the doorway. "Long before I came to Badland for the first time, Wright, I swore I would kill you. I have sworn at every place I have gone. It was hard for me not to kill you when I first met you in Badland, but I knew there were many other things to be done before that pleasure would be mine. But I really wanted to see you squirm, to hear you beg for water in a fevered voice. I wanted sand for you to lie in, a blazing desert sun, the cold stars at night, the wolves howling around you. I really wanted you to die as one before you died, a youth shot down without warning, without the sign of a weapon upon him, a boy killed on the desert, left there in the baking sun." The voice rose to booming thunder. "No death could be death enough for you. May you now lie and twist and groan, may you." I know you now." Wright managed to gasp that. I might have known that you would never quit a trail. And I'll tell you who you are. You're—" The drowning thunder of another shot halted him. Wright was lying there twisted to a knot on his side. He jerked into a straight, grotesque figure on the floor and suddenly relaxed, the blood fluttering from a round hole in the center of his forehead. "For once I let my tongue run away with me," intoned the man in black, his voice carrying a regretful ring. "I should have allowed him to lie and wonder why he was shot. But drag him to the door, you." The muzzle of the Colt showing through the slit in his robe suddenly switched toward Rip. "We'll take the body away and drop it in that dry well below the corrals." He moved a pace to one side as Rip grasped the still body of Wright by the back of the coat collar and hastily snaked him to the door, stepping back obediently as a burly, black-masked man in the hallway came forward to take charge of the body. It was dragged on. The door started to close. It almost did close, and then it was thrown violently open, and the man in the black robe again stood there. For a long minute there was silence, only those shining black heads of snakes showing through the holes in the cowl snakes that seemed to be flicking out their tongues, and little wicked lights sparkling in the heads that might have been the eyes. Suddenly a burst of almost insane laughter filled the room. Perhaps it was the work of a madman after all. The masked man had suddenly sobered. There was something now that seemed far more grim and terrible in his tone than ever before. "Who'll live to tell the tale? Anyone in this crowd?" "No. Not one. A promise I keep, even as I promised the girl to be returned safely here. To this room, without a hair disturbed on her fair head, she was returned. My word I keep. Not for my life would I forfeit it. Can anyone in this room say as much for himself? No. Life to you is a wonderful thing, and yet after the sun dawns on the morning after the morning already on its way, Monday, if you do not understand me, you will all die here. That, also, I promise you. I lie not to any man. And I should have allowed right to suffer." Again that deeply mournful intonation had come into his voice. For once the finger on the trigger was quicker than the thought. Perhaps it was hate. "I shot. I killed the thing I wanted, most of all in life, to see live and suffer, to know the meaning of pain, the hurt of it, the misery, the sweat of it. Have I been unbalanced by close association with all the breed I hate?" The hooded head had rocked back. He seemed to have forgotten everybody in the room in front of him. He seemed to have ceased talking to them. It was as if he was addressing something far, far away, something high above him, something he, alone, could see through a break in the planks and logs that was invisible to all others. He was like a man offering up supplication, an apology to his great Maker. Afraid? His voice had become whisper soft. Afraid? Of what? These? He waved his hands to indicate all the people in the room, and even those behind him. Never. His right hand slapped his chest. Not I. Look at me. Take a deep breath, and look at me. What do I fear? Me, who hates every one of you. He stepped a pace forward. Every muscle under the robe seemed to strengthen, to strain, and to stand out like ropes beneath the skin. In the most powerful, awe-inspiring voice a man could imagine, he began. "I've scared you in the city, I've scalped you on the plain. Go count your loved ones where they fell beneath my leaden rain." His voice seemed to die away, like a hurricane that had come and gone, and then laughter again shook the robe. "Once in the long ago, when one of my forebears was dying," he said, he sang that Cherokee Indian death song in front of the firing squad just before the bullets pierced his heart. "Now, who am I?" With a quick, upward snatch, he ripped off his hood. A single gasp rose from his awestruck prisoners. A bared broad face stared at them, the hair long, blue-black and parted in the middle, braids of it hanging down the man's chest, the blazing eyes filled with scorn, the nostrils of the long, hooked nose quivering with emotion. It was Chief Hair of the Dog, the medicine show dummy. Chapter 16. A burning fuse. "Perhaps you would like me better if I grunted." A smile twisted across the Indian's face. "Perhaps I should say, me not big Chief Hair of Dog. Cherokee white man call Standing Wolf. And Standing Wolf I am, sworn to hate all of you as long as I live, as long as a breath lives in this body. And maybe you know now why I wanted Hargrove as a front man for me when we go to the bank in Gun Creek Junction. An Indian could not get the money. And why the hell do you hate everybody so bad?" demanded Sheldon, suddenly finding his voice. "Somebody done you wrong, I reckon, Standing Wolf. The white man robbed the red of his country, as the white man has robbed all other people on the face of the earth." The sparkling black fire of his Ellis maniac was burning in the Indian's eyes now. "He has placed the red man on reservations, and has then robbed him of his reservation. We are always on the move. No place is ours for long. As my forebears fought you, so do I. But I fight you in another way. I strike at your pocketbooks, at your banks, your vaults. Even when the white man sent me to school, I hated him for it. But it stands me well, as I believe you are beginning to see." He was gone then, as if tired of talking to them. The door closed. The bars on the other side of it banged noisily, and they heard heavy footsteps moving away. "Phew!" exclaimed Sheldon. "The Hair of the Dog turned out to be hot stuff, did he? And who in heaven's name would have ever suspected him?" whispered Dr. Hargrove. "No wonder our medicine show had a hard time keeping him in place. Me go way ride choo-choo. He was always saying that. He was always going up and down the line. The last man in the world to suspect," nodded Rip. "We're up against a proposition with that fellow." Hours passed after that with men coming and going beyond the door. Their watches told them when morning came, And later they were given a pail of hot coffee by a ruffian in a mask who opened the door while others stood behind him with drawn guns. Rip had looked over the room many times. They were as safe, as far as escape was concerned, as if they had been in a bottomless pit. The room was in the oldest part of the house. Luft thought it was the original cabin of the old walking bar rafter. The logs were hand-hewn and placed together as closely as planks. Overhead the beams were as large around as a man's body, and the planks above them were probably 3 or 4 inches thick, like the great door. Safe as in hell, Sheldon finally admitted. And not a thing in here to dig out with even if we wouldn't get shot when we started to dig. Rip said nothing. He had found but one thing, and not yet was he going to mention it. In looking over the old shelves, he had discovered a rusty 7-pound flat iron on the top shelf. He had not moved it other than to slide it farther back on the shelf. Just what he could do with it was yet something he could not quite fathom, but it would be there when he wanted it. Not until 6 o'clock Monday morning did Standing Wolf return. All during the long wait, Rip and the others had been as patient as they could. Rip had talked for hours with Beth Luft and her mother, doing his best to console them. Luft had talked for hours with Dr. Hargrove. Rip could see that for some reason Luft had confidence in the man's being able to help them. And in the meanwhile, Bull Sheldon, undaunted even now, had struck up a line of talk with Bill Bradbury. "Luft, I want you now." Standing Wolf wore no robe as he now stood in the doorway with 4 or 5 of his gunmen behind him. "Come out. The time is getting short." White-faced but unwavering Luft rose. He glanced at his wife and daughter as if it was to be the last time he would ever look at them. Even Rip felt that it would be the last they would see of the man, but he was back with them within an hour, and his face looked terrible in its ghastliness. "And now you can come, Doctor," ordered Standing Wolf in an oddly pleasant voice. "You might bid the others goodbye. It will be the last you will see of them." But Hargrove seemed to have lost his voice. He turned and bowed, and then he was gone. And once more the heavy door was closed and the bars dropped in place. "And that's the last," whispered Luft, "that we will see of any of them. I signed away my life to the devil. He will ruin me when he gets to the bank in Gun Creek Junction. But it won't matter. No, it won't matter. God. Somebody will come, Dad." Beth Luft put her arm around him. "We'll be rescued. You're a brave girl, Beth." He patted the girl's hand, and turned to put his arm around his wife. "Both of you are brave. You have both made life very happy for me. Julia. Whatever happens to us, I want you to know that." None of them caught his true meaning, but Rip noticed that Luft kept watching the door with terror in his eyes. He was like a man waiting for something, and finally there were sounds beyond the door. Booted feet scraped. Rip heard a heavy box carefully lowered against the door. Another followed in a few minutes. When the third came, William Luft leapt from the floor. He rushed to the door, and started beating on it like a man gone crazy. "No! No! No!" he cried, bringing blood from his fingers as he kept clawing at the door. "Anything but that. I've done every last thing you've told me. Take all I have. Take everything I own, but for God's sake don't do what you are doing now. Don't. Don't." Tears were pouring down the man's lined face, and then he was silent, his ear pressed to a crack, his hand held up for silence as the girl and her mother rushed to him. Suddenly he was laughing. It was ghastly, it was fiendish, a white face staring, eyes bulging in their sockets, and a man roaring out one fit of wild, nerve-splitting laughter after another. "Dad?" Beth Luft struck him on the chest as if suddenly terrorized by him. "Dad, have you gone raving mad? Mad?" It sobered Luft for an instant. "Mad?" He repeated the word in an awesome whisper. "Yes, completely and absolutely mad. They have lighted the fuse." "What fuse?" demanded Rip. "What are you talking about?" "The fuse," whispered Luft. "Coils of it spliced together. A fuse that will burn for 2 hours and then his left hand reached out, clawing into the air like a talon, and then 400 pounds of dynamite will explode just beyond the store. It will be an explosion that will be heard all over Badland. It will be a sound that will go into every tent and house. At 9 o'clock it will do that. Then clouds of black smoke will rise from the wreckage of this house. All Badland will start running this way. The whole town will see the flames. Everybody will come, and what will they find when they get here?" He was staring up at the ceiling. "I can tell you. They'll find smoke, and flames. Flames pouring from this house and flames pouring from the barn. There will be no one to tell the tale. No evidence, no way for the people in Badland to know. He sank back against the door with hopeless dread in his eyes. "We'll all be dead." Rip caught him just in time. He eased him onto the floor and flattened him out on his back. William Luft had fainted from his own terrible thoughts. Chapter 17 Wait. Rip had taken down the heavy old flat iron, and Sheldon reached for it eagerly. Don't try to start anything yet. There are still guards beyond that door. Do you want a bullet slapped in your face and the iron taken away from us? Why didn't you say it was in here long before this? Demanded Sheldon. We might have been able to knock Standing Wolf in the head and struck up a fighting dash for it. Why didn't you say you had it? I'm axing you. Because, you damn fool, whispered Rip. I didn't trust Dr. Hargrove. He's in cahoots with Standing Wolf. Hargrove's a part of that gang, you thick-headed old ape. Have you gone cockeyed? Sheldon glowered at him. Hell, Doc was a prisoner same as us. And there's his gal in that sheep herder cabin somewhere. And weeping her little eyes out, sneered Rip. A frail beauty in the hands of bold, bad men. You should have stayed with your pansy onesie. She's the only thing I know who's as thick as your head. They had carried Luft back to the other end of the room. Bradbury and the two women were working over him. The man was a nervous wreck. At times he sobbed like a baby. At others he lay there swearing violently. And Sheldon kept growling with impatience. It was all Rip could do to keep him quiet. At 8 o'clock Rip had to almost fight him to hold on to the old flat iron. You're playing for time, all right, growled Sheldon, but you're playing it too close to your belly to suit me. The smell of the burning powder of the fuse was already seeping into the room in a sickening cloud. Rip waited a little while longer. At 10 minutes after 8 he stepped to the door, and struck it a furious blow with the rust-eaten flat iron. And didn't even budge off a splinter, exclaimed Sheldon. Keep hammering hell among the yearlings in one place. They ain't nobody out there on guard now or you would have already got yourself a bullet in the brisket. Here, let me hammer it. Once started, they were desperate about it. They kept hammering, first Rip, then Sheldon, then Bradbury, and finally William Luft, who was like a wild man in action. The door was like iron. All the flat iron was doing was merely making pits in the long-seasoned old planks. Try the ceiling, cried Rip at 8:30. Maybe we can punch up some of those planks. No use trying it. Luft screamed back. There's a concrete porch on top of this part of the house. It's through this door or we die. Then we'll try the floor, cried Rip. Give me the iron and let me at least have a try. No use, damn it, insisted Luft, his face streaming with perspiration and the flat iron swinging with furious strokes. There's a concrete wall around the house. It's through this door, I tell you, or we die. They were like fighting animals in a trap when 10 minutes to 9 came. At any moment now the explosion might come. No one could reckon the moment. Then it was 5 minutes to 9. Beth Luft and her mother were huddled in each other's arms and lying in the corner with their eyes filled with terror. The infernal door was still holding. It had been made to withstand the attacks of rustlers and Indians, and it would take more than hammering to break it down. 9 o'clock came, and with it came a tragedy. The handle of the iron broke off as Sheldon was swinging it like a crazy man. The iron dropped to the floor. Sheldon turned and looked helplessly at Rip. He walked over and thrust out his hand. We're through. There was a hard grin on his face as he gripped Rip's hand, but there was something shiny in his eyes. Riding the trail with you was his voice cracked. Well, I reckon you know what I mean. I know. Rip clamped a firm hand on his shoulder, an odd little grin playing about the corners of his mouth. He paused. A terrible silence had been holding the room. Now a noise had sounded beyond the door. Rip heard somebody swear violently. Looks like they're trying to burn up and blow up the whole damned shebang. And then the bars of the door were being removed. Suddenly the door was flying open. A tall ghost of a man with a flowing white beard and armed like a Jesse James Raider stood there with his eyes reddened with smoke. Wins Cruz! Screamed William Luft. Cruz from Singing Organ. Sure it's me. Barked back the ghost. What in hell you trying to do to yourself? We saw the smoke and smelled burning powder. Me and my bunch riding on Badland to shoot it out with Killer Virgil this morning. Dan died last night. Where the hell are you going? To the barn, cried Luft. The barn. Wait. Cruz caught him. The barn's all right. We put out the fuse there. Only had 6 or 8 feet more to burn, just like it was here. You ain't by any chance excited about something, are you, Luft? Chapter 18. Hellions were riding within a very few minutes after the coming of Cruz and the rest of the gang from Singing Organ Pass. Guns were snatched up. Horses were saddled. Armed with rifles and 6-shooters, a mob was pouring toward Badland. Bum your damned leather. Cruz was yelling. Make your hosses fly. We'd a rid on ahead, Luft, but we've been to the damn town once this morning and shot it out with the fella what's in charge of the jailhouse. We'd only fuss up another ruction if we went in again. Beth Luft was riding with them. Her mother was there, and even the Chinese cook. For once Sheldon was keeping quiet. The crazy remains of the derby was jammed tightly on his head, and he was pouring the quirt to his horse. Soon now Badland was showing. There had been one gunfight in the town, just as Wind's crews had said. There would have been another if William Luft had not been there to stop it. When all that mob of riders came pouring down the street with the hoofs ringing in a reverberating thunder that seemed to shake the whole town. "They got it," Luft yelled after dashing into the little bank and rushing out of it. "Cleaned out everything, everything. And they took your best engine and best coach." An excited man was explaining a few minutes later as the news of what had happened was electrifying the town. "And the two men who can pull an engine as well. They burned Wind for the depot after that, and when they rushed into the telegraph office with a man who could use a telegraph instrument, they were doomed to another disappointment." "Line's dead," yelled the operator. "They've naturally stopped down the track and cut their wire." "But we're following them," cried Luft. "Get that engine over there to a coach, Beth. Help her, Rip. Cruz, you and half of your men take over Badland. I've told you who to look for and who to jail. Take complete charge. I will if I can stand the stink of this damn town." howled the old singing organ passer. "Come on, Luke, Juan, Friday. That's all I'll need to handle things here now. Dirty Butter, you and the rest hit that coach, and don't come dragging back here like a pack of sick hounds and say you couldn't catch that Indian and his bunch. You'll catch them or I'll cut all your throats and stretch your worthless skins on the bushes. I like this country." Sheldon was yelling that 20 minutes later as a wheezy old engine and a rattle-trapped day coach were hurling them down the line with the girl once again at the throttle and Sheldon grinning in the wind from the locomotive's cab window. "A fellow won't ever grow no grass on the seat of his pants round here. Toot your whistle, gal, and let's see if this coffee pot can sing like the other one did." "Get off that box and take this shovel for a while," yelled Rip. "Damn it, am I the only man who can bail in coal? I can bail her, brother." A man among the gang riding on the old tender yelled down. "Pass Happy Jack your shovel." Armed men were all over the old train. They filled the coach, and some of them were atop of it, the sunlight playing harshly along the barrels of their weapons. The little old engine was eating up the track. A trestle roared, the rails bopped. Hellgate Gap seemed to blow up ahead like a flying shadow. "No use in stopping," Luft yelled that as he came pushing his way through the mob clinging to the tender. "They've either killed the operator and smashed the instruments or they've cut the wires beyond the station." The girl stormed the old engine on, its two high drivers spinning, and its antiquated brasswork shining. They were hammering up grade almost all the way to Blacksmith Pass now, but the man who had elected himself to fire was bailing in the coal. "Do you think we can catch them?" Rip moved up beside the girl. "I don't know who is pulling the engine ahead," answered the girl. "If it's Casey I won't." "Casey wouldn't have any more sense than to open the throttle wide. If Black is at the throttle he'll know enough to try to stall." "But that gang won't let him stall," exclaimed Rip. "Whoever's pulling the engine ahead is pulling it with a .45 against his backbone. And they have our best engine, too," nodded the girl. "But we have one thing in our favor. Standing Wolf and Hargrove forgot to let the water and steam out of this engine before they started. They roared into Blacksmith Pass at last." Just beyond the pass itself was the little dinky station with a crowd of people around it. Beth Luft applied the air as she closed her throttle. Some of the noise fell away, enough for Luft to yell a question at the crowd. "Went through 40 minutes ago and going like a bat out of hell." That was the answer to Luft's question, and the girl nodded as she opened the throttle again. "Casey's pulling." She cried that at Rip. "We'll never overtake it." "Not unless you've got more nerve than Casey." Rip yelled that. "Let this old battle axe rear, Beth." "What do you want me to do, straighten out the curves?" cried the girl. "Sure, gal. Put in Sheldon. Uncurl all the damn bends and sort of wrap them up in a bundle as you pass them by. I've got a horse what can outrun this busted winged buzzard." The reckless bravery of the girl was amazing. Some of the curves were terrible. Rip saw her face go white several times. Once he caught her closing her eyes tightly and heard startled yells from the old tender in the coach as the train whipped like a fish-tailing wind around Rattlesnake Bend. But the throttle was wide. The girl kept it there. "Smoke ahead, sugar pie." Sheldon yelled that as they were rounding a long bend to the left. "I think you're sort of letting your old buggy mare out of might and kind of catching up with them." "No, you ain't, damn it." He bawled that a few seconds later. "It's a wooden trestle ahead, and she's burning. Shut this damn thing down." A red flag was waving ahead of them. A three-man section crew was already at the trestle fighting the flames. The girl sawed down on the whistle cord, sending a wild warning blast over the hills. "You're taking a chance, Beth." Terror was in Rip's face now. "You're taking a chance. I can still see the rails," she cried. I'm going through." Showering sparks of fire and billowing smoke filled the cab an instant later. The old trestle swayed like a drunken farmer, and then it was behind, the roar of its overhead work dying away to the scream of a whistle as a little herd of sheep showed ahead and brought Sheldon tumbling from the fireman's seat and crouching on the floor of the cab. "She's plumb foolish at times, boys." He grinned that when they were a mile beyond the sheep. "Apt to throw mutton in your face if you don't watch her." They whipped around another bend. The girl was staring eagerly ahead. "If they stopped for water at Eagle Rock, I've got a chance," she cried. "It would take them all of 20 minutes. There's only a pipe and a slow flow there." She turned her head, staring down at the gauge on the side of the tender. Then she was looking ahead again. Suddenly Rip saw her eyes brighten. "Look," she cried. "They did stop. They're fighting it out with Tombstone Hill now. Look. Can't you see the smoke?" Rip stared. There was smoke ahead, a dot of it rolled against the skyline in the distance. "We're catching up," he cried. "We're catching up," echoed other voices. "We're hauling the gang sign down, boys. Hurrah for the gal. If only we please won't run out of water." There was almost a sob in the girl's tone as she looked back and down at the water gauge on the tender again. "Pray, Sheldon, pray." She glanced across the cab. "What do you say?" He dived off the fireman's seat and came over to her. "Pray that we don't run out of water," cried the girl. "We didn't stop at Eagle Rock." "Oh, yeah." Sheldon scratched his head, then looked up at Rip. "You do the praying. I'm kind of rusty." They were thundering down a long grade and had just whipped around a sharp bend when a cry went up. A mile ahead now was the other engine and the coach. "Black must be at the throttle, after all," cried the girl. "Look." She turned suddenly to Rip. "Go forward along the running board and climb down to the pilot. See that the coupling is open. I'm catching up and I'm tying these two trains together." Rip made his way forward. The trains seemed to be leaping together now. He climbed down to the pilot, and opened the coupling. It took time, and as he was climbing back to the high old running board above the singing drivers he heard something ring like a gong on the steam dome above him. "It was a bullet," cried the girl when he made his way back to the cab. "The fight's on." But why are you standing in front of me? You're the first one they'll try to kill. Don't you know that? Keep your head inside the cab." They fought it out at Misery Buttes. The girl coupled the trains by gradually gaining on the one ahead. Now she slammed closed her throttle. She applied the air, and then it was up to the men. Guns were roaring. With a deadweight dragging on the forward train, it was not long until the engine was shutting off its steam, and the double train oozed to a halt. Now it was a pitched battle. The outlaws ahead finally tried to take to the bushes. It was to their sorrow. Men fell dead as they dived from the old coach and the engine. In a few minutes it looked like it was over. A dozen men had surrendered. The shooting died away. Rip left the engine and started forward. William Luft, with a pair of .45s filling his hands, followed him. "Look out!" Rip yelled just in time. "Duck!" Two men had appeared, dropping out of the cab of the engine ahead. The first was Standing Wolf, a snarling beast armed to the teeth. Dr. Hargrove was right behind him, and the Indian was shooting as he came with his head bare, his usual blanket around him, and a single feather spinning in his hair. A bullet whistled past Rip's cheek. It was the last bullet Standing Wolf ever fired. Rip's first shot struck the Indian hard high. It stopped the man's wild bull rush as if he had suddenly collided against a stone wall. He stood there, big gun slipping out of his hands, and then, before he could fire again, Rip saw Dr. Hargrove die. Bull Sheldon killed him from the cab window with a single roar of a .45. "He fooled me," growled Sheldon a few minutes later, "and I ain't the kind to like to be fooled. I was ready to weep with him about that gal of his being held in that damn sheep herder cabin. And he fooled me, too." Luft was crying 20 minutes later after they had recovered the payroll and the most of all the other payrolls besides. "I gave him a letter of immunity. He would have been a hero. He played me so that he could return to Badland. Later on, when the company became reorganized, the ghost gang would have been back. But they started to Gun Creek Junction. To Gun Creek Junction, the Undertaker and the jail they'll go." They landed back in Badland Tuesday afternoon with another engineer in the locomotive's cab and Beth Luft riding with Rip and the others in the old coach. Bull Sheldon was there, dressed up like a dude in another brand new blue serge suit, a wide, soft-brimmed gray hat, and a pair of black boots. Beth Luft had taken charge of him. "I'll never wear another hard hat again," Sheldon had told Rip. "In that fight I was in, I felt sure that the brim of it would cut my head clear off." When they stepped off the train, Sheldon waited impatiently for Rip to part temporary company with the Lufts. He was anxious to be moving. "The love bugs bit you, too," he grinned. When Rip finally joined him. "I can see it in your eye. I can see it in that pretty gal's eye, too. I reckon we've both come to the end of the rambling trail and at the fork where we settle down. You're going out and run the ranch for Luft, and naturally I'll bring Pansy May along. Hang it all, I like these parts, and I'm even horse wild about Badland now. 'Twas here I met my honey." Groups of excited people kept stopping them. Badlander's gunmen had been mopped up. The jail was so full of them there was barely standing room left. "We got things done," grinned one of the cruises when they met him just as they reached the main street. "I've always said Badland could be made a good place to live in. I like this town," boasted Sheldon. "I'm damn nigh crazy about it. Then go to church on Sunday for a change," grinned on Cruz. "A sky pilot and a covered wagon come in yesterday. There's already been 4 weddings and more to come. Now you've stumbled around and said something," grinned Sheldon. "I need a sky pilot. A sky, He stopped suddenly, staring up the street. Rip looked, and then stared with him. A vision was coming, a couple of visions that Rip had seen before. One was all pipe stem legs and dangling arms, goose-eyed and gangling-necked. It was dressed in robin egg blue and wearing a sky-riding derby with a chin strap to keep it from blowing off in a side wind. That was Slick Riley, a possum-grinning yokel all dressed up and parading down the main street. "I think," Rip heard Sheldon growl there beside him, "that something either come off or backfired ground here." Sheldon was staring at the second vision. It was the enormous Pansy May dressed in shining red save for a big green straw hat on the back of her head with bright pink cherries atop of it nodding in the breeze. "Meet the wife and don't laugh," grinned Riley as they came up arm in arm. "Ain't she the pretty little thing?" Bull Sheldon looked sick, but he was philosophic about it. "Serves me right for taking up with any hatchet spur Riley. And,